If you didn't see my video yesterday, I announced that I'm doing my deep dive, in-depth literary analysis of The Prisoner's Throne. Let me discard that. And in my video yesterday, I go a little bit more in detail, but pretty much with these, I am actively reading the book and then just dissecting it. I am cracking it open, autopsy, archaeologist kind of style. I also have done this for the entirety of The Cruel Prince and the first book in this duology, The Stolen Heir. Yes, The Stolen Heir. And it's a little buried in my feed, but check out my profile. I combine them in YouTube too if you want to see it, but they're here. I have them here too, and I'm very excited to finally get into this. I took a small break to do If We're Villains. By small, I mean 8 months. And before I get started into this, I just want to let everyone know, as a reminder, this is my second time reading this book, and also the chapters are insanely long. So there's not going to be a lot of chapters to this, but there's going to be a lot of parts. So each chapter is going to be probably broken up into many parts because they're roughly between 15 to 25 pages each. It's insane. I don't think any of the other chapters and any of the other books within this universe are that long. I think it's very rare, but in this book, they each that long. So let's get started. I don't know if you read the poem in the beginning of the book. I definitely am guilty of sometimes skipping or skimming it, but I find them very interesting. And this one actually tells us a lot about Oak. It's a wonderful description of the kind of creature Oak is, because he's a honey talker, a love talker. And in this poem, it's a tale of a young woman coming across a handsome man that's handsomer than any young man that she's ever come across, but yet she counters it with his eyes were blacker than a sloe. So she senses something's off of this person, but still so handsome, voice so sweet compared to the croning of old Kevin's pipes. And then she says, my grief, that bitter hour drained the light from me. And that's what they take from you, is that you're so caught up, because she says that, we two clung together with the world shut out. I thought him a human lover, though his lips and mine were cold. So there's all these signs, but you get so caught up into this kind of form of magic. It's a love magic. That's what they take from you, is your attention and your emotions and your time. And it is going to be beautifully illustrated with Oak in this book. And we see it a little bit in the other, and I think it's, we see with his past lovers how engrossed they get with him, how far they're willing to go for him, and they get so sucked in and he can't shake them off. And it's interesting to then get his point of view of how it feels to be on the other end of that. And so the theme of this book is what's real and what's magic, and how much is a real person and how much is the accidental magic falling off of you. Do people generally like him, or is it the magic? And it's the same with Ren. It's for us to understand the doubt that Ren has, that does she generally like Oak? Does he generally like her? Or is it the magic? Is he using it on her purposely or accidentally? And I really like this idea that we see throughout the story is going to be, the magic aspect, because I think in the other books we see Maddox and Locke, for instance, excuse their behavior on the kind of creature they are. The magic is expected, it's within their nature, but is it really within your nature, or is it nurtured? But then we're seeing with Oak, he may be trying not to use his magic, but is it coming off of him accidentally? Is it just vibrating off of him and picking others up, like a Pied Piper kind of sound that he's not intentionally playing? So I think this poem wonderfully illustrates the kind of creature he is and sets us up for this story. The fun part about Oak, and I think it goes into his love talk that I was just talking about in that previous clip, is that he says things and then you have to infer his tone. So, for instance, Lady Elaine's still in bed, he's getting dressed, and she's saying, I haven't made you late. It won't be too much longer before you don't have to do anything at their beck and call. And he says, yes, distracted, only yours, right? And I think that's on the surface level, the siren call, the lovers talk, and they can interpret it in a romantic lover kind of way, but we have to then start to infer that he's saying it sarcastically, bitterly, and they're missing that. And I like with Cardan too that there's this nuance and double meaning to the words, and then it's up to us to interpret which the meaning could be. This brief sentence little interaction illustrates why I think Holly Black is a brilliant writer, and this is all I want from other writers, which is that just one brief sentence shows us a lot more and doesn't tell us something. So with the palace laundress yelling after Oak, "Hurry, you scamp, it will look ill if they begin without you, and fix your hair." On the surface level, it just shows us that Oak is late to something. But if you actually pause to think, it's also showing us a lot more than just that. It's showing us the level of deference or respect he has in here, that a lowly servant could lecture Oak. And I think it shows, if you stop to think about it, like the kind of distance between the royal family and its servants, which is that its closing is not as far as maybe it had once been. That, is showing kind of Cardan and Druid's rule, but also how Oak has kind of interacted himself or placed himself within it, that he probably interacts with these people, or there's been a level where it's been okay for someone like a palace laundress to lecture him. I love this interaction between Oak and Arenia because, one, it's showing that he sees her as his mother, even though at this point in time he is knowledgeable that she's not his birth mother, but he always has seen her as his mother. But also that, like, he grinned at her fondly, letting her fuss. If she thought him as a barely more than a boy, then she wouldn't look more deeply into any of the trouble he made for himself. So, like, it's interesting that he wants to break free of his family kind of babying him, but yet he lets it happen at the same time because it allows him to kind of go under the radar, which is a very Cardan kind of move of presenting one kind of front, one mask, while he does something in the background that he's a completely different person, but then hating the mask that he had put on himself. So that's why I really like Oak, is that he reminds me a lot of Cardan in that sense. But I like that, like, he does this for his family. He does this for Arenia because he knows it comforts Arenia to do this too, and he's very mindful of this. And I just like this interaction. Oh my god, it's just like little things that she does tells us so much. So, for instance, Arenia squeezed back swift and punishingly hard when Oak grabbed her hand, and like, it's doing so many things. So, on one level, it's showing that they're comforting of one another. They have familiar love for one another, but she is punishingly hard because she's about to tell him, like, you are heir to all of Elfheim, like reminding him of his place, like lecturing him and stuff. But it's also like a reflection of Fairy, where, like, even where there's love, there's this pain to Fairy. And we see this with Jude and Cardan, that they love each other, but there's this like kind of aggressive violence to this love, if that makes sense. And so we see it even here, that like the love in this story is very different than the love, for instance, in like a Stephanie Garber Caravel Once Won a Broken Heart story. And yeah, I think like just this like little detail, just one line, has me obviously talking for a minute. What Arenia says to Oak also is fascinating because she says it's time to start behaving like someone who could rule. Never forget that you must inspire fear as well as love. Your sister hasn't. On one note, it perfectly reflects Fairy, that is this, again, violent kind of love going on here, but also like it reflects Arenia and how she grew up in Maddox's household for what, like, not grew up, but she had spent a good amount of time in Maddox's household and saw how fear was useful, and she used fear instead of love when teaching the girls, for instance. I don't know about Oak as much. Like, we really didn't see her raising Oak and interacting with Oak in the original series, but she was interacting with the Taryn and Jude. She used fear to lecture them, to teach them, to parent them. And so it's interesting that she's using it here, but also saying that, like, your sister hasn't forgotten. She's doing what she's expected to do. She is fitting within the norm, but that's a other thing, she's not fitting within the norm. And Arenia hated that she didn't fit into the norm, that she broke free and did her own thing, and it frustrated Arenia at times, even though it ended up working in all their benefit to a point. So it's fascinating that she is then turning around being like, you should act like your sister, someone that she didn't like at first. When Oak describes Jude, he says that her hair is done up in the familiar horns, and I think it's just to remind us that this is her way of kind of blending in. She might have described Taryn as being a chameleon in The Wicked King, but she does it too with her hair. While her hair being pulled back into that style does show off her roundness of her ears, it also is very animalistic of a hairstyle, a very fairy-like, because a lot of the fairies have strange features and a lot of them have animal features. And so with this, if you're at a distance, it looks like she belongs. It's only when you get up close and see her ears that you'll notice that she's human, that she's pretending and she's masking, like she is one of them, when she's still not quite. So while she has grown and developed throughout her series, it's showing that she still kind of is trying to pretend to be like them, trying to pretend like she is one of them, if that makes sense. So it's showing that Jude and Cardan still have more growth for them to go through, that their growth wasn't done at the end of their series, the growth is still going on. When Oak says that, like, these are supposedly his subjects and not one of them afraid of him despite what his mother had hoped, made me stop and think about how it's so fascinating, because I think part of the reason why Jude did a lot that she had done was to give Oak the childhood that she didn't get, to be free, carefree, and happy. While it wasn't perfect, as we learn in the last book, it's still, he is more carefree and happy, and it's illustrated here that they're not afraid of him. Not in the way that, like, Jude briefly was when he uses magic to enscowl her and, like, have her hit herself on his command. But, like, no one else had that kind of, like, interaction or level of interaction. He seems happy, carefree, and so their guard is down and they don't fear him, and that works in his benefit a little bit, but also doesn't. That they think that they can walk all over him, and we see that being a problem for him time and time again, at least with Cardan. While people like Balkan expected little from him, others were slightly afraid of him because he did do actions like ripping the wings off a fairy boy to have others, lessers, be afraid of him. And Oak hasn't quite learned that, but at the same time, he's not willing to do that. And I think Jude and Terry and them don't want him to do that, but at the same time, he kind of needs to do that. So this is a really weird, contradictory thing that Oak is at the crossroads of what is he supposed to do because of the normal state of the society and his role within it, but also what his sisters kind of would have hoped for him, which is to not be like that, but at the same time he kind of has to be like that, if that makes sense. Oh, I noticed something I didn't notice before, which is that this prologue is showing us that I think this is the first time Oak is getting a crown, that he's being crowned the prince, heir prince. It was assumed before, but I don't think he was crowned. So when Oak uses the crown and wears it on and off in the last book, in The Stolen Heir, that is his first time having it. He didn't have it all his life. He wasn't wearing it all his life and used it all his life. That was new to him. So it's fascinating that he did bring it along with him, and also him using it, and then his feelings towards using it. And I think it's really wonderfully illustrated here that this is a brand new thing to him. So I think that adds more depth to his character. This is another instance where Oak reminds me a lot of Cardan, at the same time has his own problems. So like Cardan, he didn't ask for the crown. Jude placed it on both of them in that moment. But at the same time, like, Cardan was trapped, and it would be worse if he gave it up. It would be worse for him and everyone, and he was still trying to impress Jude, I think, a little bit. But with Oak, for him, it was that he would have loved to have said no to Jude, but he felt like he owed all his sisters so much that it felt impossible to deny them anything. He has this guilt that's, like, not outright used against him, but subtly inferred all these years, that he feels like he can't say no to this. And so that is fascinating to see how the two of them, so alike and yet so dissimilar, that they both don't like the crown but have a good head on their shoulders to respect it and the power that comes with it, but it's only been thrust upon their head by Jude. And it's fascinating to think of then Jude's role in this, and her almost selfishness. Like, she's not taking into consideration either of their feelings, but at the same time, as we learn throughout this duology, that it's important that the crown goes to a Greenbrier line because the magic is linked to their family's bloodline. So what would happen to Elfhame if we don't have a Greenbrier to inherit the throne? And to continue that, I think this is a really an interesting dynamic when Jude kisses his cheek and says, "You will be a great king when you're ready." Like, she's giving him the option of choosing when he will have this, but not realizing that she's equally not giving him an option to do this at all. Like, he has to do it. It's inevitable. But he at least gets the choice of when he gets to do it. He doesn't have to do it now. He can wait, unlike Cardan, who didn't get a chance to wait. He had to do it then. But she's not really giving him a choice whether or not he wants to do it at all. Another similarity between Cardan and Oak is their upbringing and parentage. They both feel unwanted slightly, but like Cardan more so in the aftermath, whereas Oak at least was wanted. He was loved by Arenia, Maddox, and his sisters, but he still has to live with the knowledge that he was a mistake. As he says on page 6, Oak was a living, breathing mistake. He wasn't meant to exist, and he had caused a lot of problems with his existence. And it's that knowledge and that guilt, and then like how that is affecting him as a character and his personality. And I love this like little bit of his background and history and how it influences Oak's choices in the present. On page 7, we also learn that Dane had sought to hasten his succession to the throne, poisoning his father by incremental degrees to steal his vitality until he abdicated. So when Leo fell pregnant, Dane wasn't going to let his Biblo mess things up. Oak, I believe, was 8, maybe, when the whole thing in the Corporans happened, the whole accession, and his father stepping down. So that means that Dane had been poisoning his father for over 8 years, because it had to have happened before, his mother fell pregnant with him. So this means that he's been working on this slowly for that long. One, it's showing how fairies can work minutely, that they have time on their hand, but also that he was willing to steadily let this happen, and then it all went to shit in the end. Like, it's just, oh, I love this like a little detail when it comes to Dane. But we also see that Oak has this slash across his thigh from a too deep cut from Arrhenia's blade, that he has this constant reminder of his violent birth and his parentage, that like even though he sees Arrhenia and Maddox as his father and mother after spending years being raised by them, he can't forget who his birth parents are. And we see throughout this book how he wonders how much of his birth parentage or birth parents influence him. How much did he inherit? What is within his nature, because it's within his genes from the people he inherited, and what was kind of grown out of him by being nurtured by other people. So like this is again the nature versus nurture conversation being continued in this series too. I love this tiny little detail that Oak has, that like Jude sits at the opposite end of the head of the table, slumped in her chair. In front of family, she's totally different from the way that she is in front of the folk. A performer off stage, still wearing her costume. They're still like they're having a banquet. Like they're slightly hidden by like these weeping willow branches, but the rest of the court is not that far away. So it's fascinating that the moment she is not in direct light, she shucks off her performance as she's like lounges. So it's showing that despite having wanted power and wanting this, and she fought for this, she equally doesn't want it and kind of hates it, which is this great relationship between wanting and not wanting the throne, of like needing it and hating it. And it's like shows that not only is Oak and Cardan experiencing it as people that were thrust upon it without wanting it or desiring it, but someone like Jude who slightly desired it, not liking it either and struggling under the weight of it. I also like within this like one paragraph on page 8 is showing this kind of like idea of family, that he's pretty much saying that he feels more related to Jude, Taryn, Vivi, and Arrhenia Maddox, the family that raised him, even though he has no blood between them. Not unlike, the only ones with blood with him is Cardan and Leander, Taryn and Locke's child, his half-brother. And despite sharing blood, he doesn't feel like them. He doesn't feel like their family, not like his sisters in the mall that he was raised with. However, we see some more similarities with Cardan, Oak, and Leander than we do with Jude, Taryn, and Vivi, for instance, and even Maddox. Despite thinking that he has adapted some of Maddox's bloodthirstiness, is it really from Maddox or is it from his father, Dane? So again, we're going to nature versus nurture. So it's described that the royal family's table is seated under a weeping willow tree, that they're kind of hidden. So I think there's a lot of symbolism there, because you would think it would be an oak tree to represent Oak taking the throne, or even there's a lot of oak motifs with the crown of Alfheim and like Alfheim itself. However, no, they're sitting under a weeping willow tree, which one, I kind of like that it's the branches are used to obscure them from the rest of court, that while they are still amongst the folks, they're obscured, they're different. And it's kind of counteracting what the description we had earlier in this prologue, where like Oak is one of the people that the laundress could reprimand him and like lecture him, but yet they're kind of obscured and hidden away, and they have masks. At least Cardan and Jude have masks, but so does Oak. Oak puts on a performance for the rest of them. They don't really know the real Oak. And at the same time, Reaping Willows symbolizes grief and mourning, and this family is filled with grief and mourning. The crown caused so much grief and mourning. This little bit of conversation from Cardan on page 8, I think perfectly represents him, because on the surface level, it seems like he's being silly, being like, oh, I can't believe they're still talking about when I was a snake. That's all the songs, all they talk about is that time I was a snake. And he's saying that, You'd think I never did a more popular thing than sit in the dark on a throne and bite people who ignored me. I could have always done that. I could do that now. And like it seems like he's being aloof and silly, like how he presents himself, but also at the same time it's him complaining. If you actually pay attention to him, it's him complaining that he is only known for this. It's been almost a decade and he is only known for this one thing that he accidentally caused to happen because he broke the crown and there's a curse on it. But like it's showing that like I think he's questioning his legacy a little bit, and also questioning like this is the thing that everyone's going to hang on, but also I think recognizing that his power kind of comes from that moment, that the respect and slight fear he has from the people comes from that one moment in time when he wasn't him and he was a snake. And I think I need to think about this a little bit more, but I think it's going to play a role in the story. One of the great things about this story, in particular this book, is that it's showing Arenia as not as meek as she appeared in the original trilogy, that she is not as much of a sideline player, that while she is taking a more feminine approach and more manipulating others and whispering in their ears an Alicent Hightower approach, she still is ambitious. She still wants to see Oak, who she sees as her own son, on the throne. I've been watching a lot of videos lately about Game of Thrones, and this one particular creator on YouTube uses this phrase when she describes the history of Game of Thrones, which is that history does not repeat but mirrors. And that's the case here when Oak says that it was one thing to flesh out plots against the throne, but if he found out his mother was involved in one, he didn't know what he'd do. And it's a mirroring. While this doesn't quite happen, it has happened. It's his father has done it, and like Cardan and Jude, and technically Cardan had acted against his own blood and his own family, and Balkan and Dane had acted against their own family. His blood father had acted against his own family, poisoning his own father. So it's showing that like while Oak can't fathom it, it has happened and it is possible. Like someone like Arenia could be capable of this, and that's the point, that history doesn't repeat, it mirrors. In this prologue, I've been describing the love as being violent, and I think it stems out of, it's not violent but harsh, and I think it comes from the society. In one of my grandmother's rambling videos I posted recently, I talked about how this society is built off a selfishness. It's a give and take, bargains and deals, it's an exchange. So you're constantly thinking of, what do I get out of this? Even when you love someone, for instance, when you do something for someone else, you're still thinking of, what do I get out of it? And the point of this, what I'm trying to say in this clip, is that it's showing that Jude is a part of this world of fairy, and it has been influenced. Her formative years were in this world, so of course she's learned out of this, that like while Jude is trying to give Oak a better future, she still does things without taking him fully into consideration, fully considering his innocence and youth, still angling to put him on the throne, just not right away. Is not much better than what Maddox was doing, but in this she benefits out of it more than Maddox benefits out of it, and she's the lesser of two evils kind of thing. So what I'm trying to say is that Jude has been influenced by fairy and does act like fairy, and while she does love Oak, there's still this selfishness in it. The love is not as pure as one might hope it or find in a different story. While Oak says Cardan was spectacle incarnate and wouldn't care if Arenia scolded him, does tell us about Cardan, which is a great description that he is spectacle incarnate, but it's also telling us about himself, that Cardan wouldn't care if Arenia scolded him, but Oak obviously would, and that's why he's not doing anything that would upset his mother or Leander's grandmother and trying to discourage Leander. So he thinks a lot about other people's thoughts and feelings, and then this is something we saw in the last book and we're going to see definitely in this book, is that he is constantly thinking of others. And then when Oak asks Leander what other things him and Cardan have done, you get a list of misbehaviors. I think it wonderfully shows that while Jude and Maul were trying to give Oak a good childhood, a carefree childhood, that wasn't the case. Oak was constantly worried about living up to his family's expectations, even if it wasn't outwardly stated to him. He felt the guilt and was constantly thinking about it, whereas Leander and Cardan actually act like kids. Cardan, who didn't have a good situation, got to actually act like a kid. Yes, he didn't have a loving home like Oak did, but he didn't equally have the pressure of responsibility because he was so under his father's notice and everyone else's that he didn't have that pressure like Oak does. Actually, upon this read through, I'm starting to realize that Oak has a slight Vivi-ness to him, that Vivi still is aloof, but she doesn't appreciate the world of fairies. She still looks down upon it. She thinks it is much colder and harsher than like the mortal world, for instance. While everyone wants to be a part of it, she doesn't want to. Oak, I think, is okay living in this world, but he also recognizes that, like, for instance, that magic wasn't fun for everyone. And he does think about that. And I think that will make him a good ruler in the future if he ever does become a ruler. But like, it's showing that he isn't blinded by the magic and the beauty and the, like, what's it called, like, mask of fairy. Like, when, like, Jude and Taryn, while yes, know the uglier side of it, still are blinded by that. It's like that poem in the beginning of this book where, like, she sees that his eyes are dark but he's handsome, his lips are cold, but she still kisses this honey talker. And it's what is happening here. While Jude and Taryn recognize that they still want to be a part of it, and Oak, yes, still is going to be a part of it, but he is starting to recognize that this is not a great society. And I like that there's this like vividness to that. I like though that Oak also recognizes why he loves his family, that they're not perfect, and that's why I think really like this book is that none of these characters are perfect. For instance, Oak is recognizing that every single one of his sisters have blood on their hand. Every single member of this family has blood on their hands in some form, and it's a wonder that others like Heather still wants to be a part of it after all this time. I think it's also very important that Jude says, "How's Dad?" She doesn't say how's Maddox because she could very easily want to distance herself, but she still recognizes him as her father, despite also knowing she was definitely old enough to know that he is not her father, but he raised her, and despite everything that he has done against her, to harm her, to belittle her, she still recognizes him as her father. She's not going to welcome him by her side, but she's also still going to recognize him as dad. Here's the thing we have to remember within this world: fairies can't lie. They can fudge the truth, but they can't lie. So when Oak is saying, "I never thought of Carden as any relation of mine, but I have often resented what he took from me, I have been looking for just this opportunity." He doesn't think this internally, he says this out loud. So there's some truth in this, obviously, for him to be able to say it. And then that's emphasized with Lady Elaine saying it in Judas and your real sister. At that, Oak smiled back but made no reply. He knew what she meant but could never have agreed. And it's showing us this and subtly reminding us without telling us that, like, hey, yeah, fairies can't lie, but like, hey, obviously he's unable to say this because he does see Judas as real sister. So it's so well done that on the surface, if you're reading kind of quickly by, you might believe in the lie that Oak's presenting, the whole falsehood that he is formulating for his scheme, and forget that the words he's saying says something because he can't lie because he's a fairy. I really like what Oak says here when he says he was certain he could go through with this, though it led inevitably to her death, and he wasn't at all sure what that meant about him. And it's showing that what he kind of said earlier, that his family has blood on their hands, whether it's done physically, like they physically unalive someone, or kind of maneuvered them on the board so that they do still end up dead like this. Like, Oak has slain people, but he has also moved them around on the board like pawns on a board, like Maddox would, and put them in situations that led to their death, and very knowingly too. So I like that he's recognizing that he's no better than the rest of his family. Like, he's trying to be good, but there's still blood on his hands. One of the important things that you should be doing in your opening chapter that I think not as many people are doing as well as they could is kind of on a minute, small scale show the overarching theme and character arc of your story. And like Holly Black, for instance, does it here in this one paragraph. In this garden full of asps, he was a pitcher plant, beckoning them to tumble. Sometimes there was a part of him that wanted to scream, "Look at me, see what I am, see what I'm doing." And he's saying that, like, while like Fairy is full of snakes, he is a pitcher plant, one that lures others in, that, you know, unknowingly thinks so not little of him, but like aren't threatened by him. They're lured in by him. They still come into this, you know, viper's nest to tumble with him, and then he tricks them because he's a snake himself too. And it's him, you know, he's doing this willingly. He's willingly putting himself out there as kind of a damsel in distress kind of character, someone that you undermine and don't think that highly of, but then he tricks you, deceives you, and he's not much better than anyone else here. Like he's not better than Cardan, Jude, Maddox, or anyone else, and he just wants to scream, "Look at me, see what I am, see what I'm doing," because everyone sees him as this mask that he has put on, this childish, mischievous, not scary, not someone that you would trust with schemes and stuff. But obviously you should trust him with schemes because he's been doing schemes, and he wants someone to acknowledge that and kind of tell him that you don't have to do that, but at the same time he wants to do that because he wants a role in this family. And like this one paragraph is perfectly summarizing Oak's character arc in this book. One of the things I love is that Cardan and Oak are so alike because they both put on this mask that has others assume less of them. And then meanwhile in the background they're obviously running schemes are much cleverer than they are appearing. So you don't expect it from them. You expect the least. So like for instance when Tyrion says he knows, glancing at the High Throne, and Oak goes, "Knows what exactly? I'm not sure, but someone overheard something, and the rumor is that you have a knife at the back. Want to put a knife in their back." So like it's showing that like while Cardan is acting aloof and you might assume that he isn't aware and doesn't care, he knows. And he is watching Oak very closely, as we see throughout this book. And that's what I like about both Oak and Cardan, is that they've put on this mask to lure others' defenses and have figured out a way then to maneuver behind them and stab them in the back. But let's understand that Cardan's logic or thought process here makes sense based off his history. It makes sense that he would view Oak warily and assume the worst of him because Oak was raised by Maddox, the man that had helped to unalive Cardan's entire family in order to put Oak on the throne in the first place, and Oak has spent a good amount of years under him and had spent time with him in the human world. He literally is the last person to have seen Maddox. And Arinia literally at this table just said, "Can't wait for your coronation." So he's assuming the worst. Also, as Tyrion points out, Cardan's own brother had betrayed him. His brothers were working against him and were willing to unalive him. So why would he expect anything less from someone that is his half brother too? Like he has precedence to be wary of him. Especially he knows that you should be wary of anyone that is close to the throne. And especially with the Greenfire magic, there's one other person that they can put on it. So of course you got to be careful around him. So of course he is keeping a wary eye because he also recognizes that Jude has a blind spot when it comes to Oak. I love this riddle that's kind of told to Oak, where one folk saying, "Look at my face and I am someone. Look at my back and I am no one. What am I? I don't know. Your mirror, your highness." Now, it's a perfect riddle because the answer would be a mirror no matter what, but for him, it works even better because that is Oak. He's putting on masks. When he faces you, he puts on whatever mask he thinks will work in his favor and works for people, and people don't know also if it's generally him or if it's his magic for being a honey talker, love talker. You have all this, but when he turns around, you're like, who really left? And that's the thought process we saw with Ren in the last book, that she falls for him and is lured by him when she faces him, but when he turns away, she starts to doubt him because who really is Oak? The birth control that Oak comes across that's for Jude is an interesting thing. One, it's to kind of let us know that the likelihood of her being pregnant and replacing Oak is slim right now, which I think that makes Oak a little sad because he literally just said a few pages ago that she's human and they're more likely to get pregnant than normal folk, and it's expected also for her to fulfill this dynasty. But I think it's really interesting parallel with Oak because while she's forcing Oak in this position, she's giving him time. She's not making him do it right now, take, leadership. She's giving him time before having to thrust the crown up completely on his head, even though he really doesn't have that much of a choice. But it's the same with Jude. The birth control is giving her a chance to have time to make a true decision of, does she really want to do this? And at least she has the safety net of knowing that Oak is heir. But the pills, I think, is to give her time. And as we see with Jude, she's continuously scrabbling and fighting for security and safety. And I think she's a little afraid of bringing someone into this world knowing that she doesn't completely have that yet, that there's always these threats, and there's going to be even more threats as she brings a child into this world too. Especially right now, there's already threats of people siding between Cardan and Oak. What would it mean if they have another in the mix too? So I could see this element has brought forth so much discussion amongst the readers of what it means with Jude and Cardan alone, like their relationship and their child, but also it's introducing this interesting dynamic in Jude's personality, in Cardan's, in Oak's, and the dynamics of power and all these kind of things, and the ability to have a choice. And in this moment, Jude's giving herself a choice, but it doesn't give Oak and Cardan choices, so there's a hypocrisy to that. There's a lot more you can unpack with it, but this little detail is fascinating. What Cardan says here is a perfect summary of the overarching story arc, with him saying, if I didn't know better, I might think that your brother is at fault. That first he wanted you to be nice to that little queen with the sharp teeth and the crazy eyes. Then he wanted you to forgive the former Falcon, his bodyguard likes, for trying to murder me. It seems too great a coincidence that Hyacinth came from Lady North, spent time with Maddox, and had no hand in his abduction. First, Cardan can tell no lies, so he genuinely believes that he should question Oak and should be concerned. He thinks that there's a possibility that he could be behind this. But the point of this is to show the overarching arc, and we see it with Ren, that there are little moments that make you question and think, is she up to something? And same with Oak, is he up to something? However, each of their actions are meant for good, but in the greater context, it can be interpreted that they're scheming something. And I love that this little thing here is emphasizing the overarching story arc. Oak's decision to go after Ren in hopes of convincing her to help save Maddox so that Jude doesn't have to make a terrible decision. Oak is acting like almost a child of divorce, trying to appease and keep everyone happy. And I don't know, I just like this aspect of his character's development, character personality. At the beginning of the previous chapter, I mentioned how long these chapters are, and this book is much longer than any of our other books on average. So, the last chapter, the prologue, was 22 pages. I think chapter 1's about 15. That being said, I just want to let you know that with each chapter, it's going to be broken up in many parts, but you're also probably going to see me in a couple different outfits because I'm going to try to record before I go to work, and I only have so much time before I go to work. So, yeah. Previously, I posted a video, and I'll probably tag it down below, where I talked about the Society of Fairy, Holly Black's version, where it is a selfish give and take kind of society. Because of the bargains and deals, you expect to get something out of every exchange. And even when you are bargaining something, because you're kind of giving something up and you're reluctant to do it, most of the time fairies find a loophole. That is part of the reason why Jude had to be very precise with her words with her deal with Cardan. And I'm saying that because with the bridal, it's almost as if it's trying to take some of that away, forcing obedience, limiting the loopholes. Doesn't mean that you can't find loopholes, as Ren and Oak discover ways to do it, but it makes it much harder. You're much more bound to someone than, say, Cardan's deal to Jude was. Also, we have to remember how important the bridal was. This was something that Ren was fearful that Oak was going to use against her all throughout the last book, since we were in Ren's POV, for her to then turn around and use it against Oak. And it's also interesting because she critiqued Hyacinth on his relationship with Tiernan, or Tiernan on his relationship with Hyacinth, keeping him there bound in hopes of just having him, afraid that if he let him go, he would lose him forever. He'd rather have him by his side and hate him than not have him at all. And that's exactly what Ren had done. She would rather have Oak by her side, hating her, than not at all. However, the bridal is giving Oak a very unique experience, kind of giving him a slight glimpse in Ren and Jude's life, which is dread. With Ren wearing the bridal, she never knew what was going to happen next, but dreaded something was going to happen. It was inevitable that something was going to happen, and she would be stuck obeying it. Similar to Jude, she never knew if something was going to happen, but she expected around every corner something will happen within the world of fairy, because of her being one of the lowest rungs on the pecking order, that they're always going to kick and make fun of and abuse humans, usually. So she dreaded constantly, and to live with that constant feel of dread affects how one reacts, whereas Oak hasn't really felt that. He always had some form of agency to act. In the last book, even when he didn't know what could happen on this journey, but he had enough agency to be able to form plans to know that he could do something, whereas Jude and Ren always had a hand tied almost. it's the little things with Holly Black that I love. For instance, Oak says it was a kindness that a former Quarter Teeth servant brought him a blanket lined in rabbit fur. And it is because he's in the cold and he feels the cold eating at his bones, but it's the fur itself, the rabbit fur. He is the rabbit caught in the trap. And I like the symbolism of that. While it is kind of protecting him, he's still a rabbit caught in a trap. What I also didn't notice the last time I just picked up on this moment is how Oak interprets that. If it was anyone else, they would almost be reluctant because it would be they're expecting a catch to getting the blanket. Like they owe the servant something then, that they want something from them, that, a bargain, a deal in this world. But because I think Oak had grown up enough in his formative years in the human world, he accepts kindness without, thinking that there's a catch to it. So going back to Ren and the bridal, the thing that's most fascinating is that she wants to keep him by her side even if he hates her, but yet she doesn't visit him. And I think it's because she knows it's bad. And by not seeing it directly, she can at least ignore those guilty feelings of putting him in this situation, but yet she's not willing to release him because she is so terrified of him never coming back in her life. So I've mentioned this in other videos, but one of the things I love about Holly Black is that she makes her characters very biased, and I think that's something that's missing in a lot of stories, that they come with very distinct views of the world and people. So for instance, Oak's like, why isn't she here to gloat? And I love it because that is the logic answer, because he's known so many people throughout his life that would come to gloat, but like he also knows from interacting with her, especially throughout their time in the last book, that that is not her. She wouldn't come to gloat. That's not her personality. But in this moment when he's tired and confused and his mind is metal from the iron, that's what he reaches for, and it adds more dynamic to the story that he says something like this, thinks something like this, that like we all know it's wrong, but he thinks this, but it also makes sense why he thinks this. So there's this low line that like Oak says where he's like, sometimes I scream just to know I can, but I wish I could tell myself a story, but pretty much that he's so depressed that he's not able to. And it kind of reminded me of like Cardan's novella. I can think of names. Cardan's novella, How the High King Learned to Hate Stories. And I think it's showing the other option outside of nature versus nurture. While their nature might try to dictate who they're going to be when they grow up, it's based on their genes and the kind of creature they are, the prophecy, those kind of things. Like they're expected that, of course, they would be like that because they're the love talker, because they were this kind of creature, or their nurture, that they were raised by cruel men like Balgan and Maddox, that they would be cruel themselves. However, it's because of stories that Oak and Cardan aren't. It's because of the story told to Cardan when he was a child that kind of directed him a different way. And then when he came across Alice in Wonderland, for instance, which made him soften and change his perspective on humans. Like stories like that changed him to want to be different. And it's the same with Oak. For instance, he's saying that he wished he could tell himself he's a tale, that he's a prince suffering a setback on a daring quest. And he also mentioned in the prologue that, Cardan said that there's all these tales and songs continuously being sung about the time he was a snake. So it's saying that like these songs and stories are continuously being shared around court of people doing great things. And I think Oak could have gone the way that Maddox had trained him, but he wants to be someone like these tales, which encourages him to be better. But also, I think it's because he wants to be not great, but set himself apart from his family, to step out of the shadow, to be someone. And he thinks that in order to be someone, he needs to do something like these tales because they're remembered for something other than being forgettable. They've done something. And that's why I think part of the reason why he went on this whole journey, one was thematics and one to help his family, but also because that's why he grew up hearing tales, heroes and princes going on journeys like this, trials like this. But this is also interesting because, like, for instance, Oak says, wherever he is, he's certainly not a hero. But I think it's so fascinating because if you look at the last story from Ren's POV, she paints him like that. She paints him like this heroic prince on a quest. That's how we've been viewing him. But in this moment, now that we're in Oak's POV, he's pointing out, I'm not that at all. I am floundering. I didn't notice this the last time, but the funny thing about Strawn, the guard, the Falcon, is that he's almost a foil to Oak, because he says that, his voice carries and he complains, but he's ambitious, bored by the tediousness of guard duty, and eager to show off his skill in front of the new queen, which is kind of like Oak. He's bored, done with the tediousness of court life, and he kind of wants to show off to Jude, for instance, that he doesn't need to be baby, that he can take care of himself, to, incorporate him in her plans and helping defend the family and the kingdom. It's moments like these that remind me how much he is like Carter, which is so fascinating, especially in this book, because they like almost are rivals, that they view each other warily, that they don't know, they don't seem close. But Oak and Carden are so alike, which makes sense. They are half brothers too, but or nephew, uncle, something like that. Nephew, uncle. But Oak realizes he's so bored he wants to make something happen. I am merely trying to give this dungeon an authentic atmosphere, Oak says. What's a place like this without the cries of the tormented? Like, that's such a Carden way. And also Carden being like, I'm so bored. I need something to happen. Strawn calls Oak Trader's son, and after he stopped talking, Oak thinks to himself in his internal monologue, Trader's son. Interesting. Not just bored then, but resentful of Maddox. And it's fascinating that he thinks of Maddox first, because it's true with both his fathers. Maddox is technically a traitor, but so is his birth father, Dane. Dane is a traitor for secretly poisoning his father and outmaneuvering and tricking other people. He's a traitor in that sense too. So he is a traitor son, double-fold, or two-fold, dual-fold. The other great thing about Holly Black's writing, and something that I think people may not realize with this book especially, is that her story moves forward because of repercussions for characters' actions. For instance, this entire duology is Oak trying to protect his family, but also Ren, and kind of making a name for himself, but his main motivation is to protect his family. But every action he has had so far has had a repercussion. For instance, here in this one, he's thinking, I need to get out, because he's thinking, I need to figure out a way to keep Ren and my family safe, to prevent them from entering a war possibly. And it's his actions previous to this that landed him in prison in the first place. So that's why I think the story is great, is that the plot moves forward because it's repercussions often of characters' actions. Oh, sweet baby darling Oak. I love him. He's like, getting out of prison is hard. It's not easy to escape. And besides, maybe after everything, Ren might still visit him. And he's like, I need to escape. I need to help, but what if Ren visits me? And I was like, honey, you're so in love that you're willing to sit here in agony and not know for sure she's going to come to you just in case she might come to you. I love it. When Ren breaks the Troll King free from his curse, Oak feels the magic of it, feels the curse breaking, and he says it's an ancient curse, so old, one so old that for Oak it seems woven into the fabric of the world, as implacable as the sea and sky. And it's foreshadowing, obviously, what's to come, the threat of Ren towards the Greenbrier line, but I think it explains a little bit of the magic of this world, that there are layers to it, but there are certain ones that if you remove it, it might affect so much more than like the surface level effects, a lot. And I don't think we really see too much of the repercussions of this curse from the Troll King being removed. Like, what happens? Like, it does the landscape change? We don't know, because they leave. But like, for instance, what would happen if there's no more Greenbriers, because the magic of Elfhame is so woven together by their magic that, like, would everything fall apart? Would it go into anarchy and chaos? Like, is it the end times? Like, what would happen? And like, we only get hints of this threat, so it's left to us to imagine what is the worst possible scenario if they are gone. Why is it so important that this family stays on the throne? I also really love Oak's excuse to the ghost of why he's not training, being that he was 11. The ghost is like, I'm not having this shit, which I think is very funny and very interesting. But it's also showing that Oak was adapting to his surroundings, that like, it's not normal for 11-year-olds to train with a sword, but it would be normal for someone within their own world. But also like acknowledging that, like, in his upbringing up to that point, he wasn't Maddox, and none of them had thrust his sword upon him. Maddox had put a sword in Jude and Terry's hand long before he ever did with Oak. So it's interesting how coddled and baby he was, and that he didn't initially want to put a sword in his hand, and now he's kind of still doesn't want it. Like, I think he respects that he has the skill to protect himself and his loved ones, but he fears it because he thinks he gets lost within the power of the sword kind of thing, that he is not fully present when he is fighting. I love that Oak is in a rock and a hard place that he had created. Is because of his choices and his actions that he's now stuck in this horrible situation where he has now put Ren and Jude against each other, and they're both formidable, and he loves both of them, and he doesn't want either one to fall, but he's kind of put in this situation where one of them kind of might have to fall. But to continue off that last clip, it's his choice right now. His wavering is wavering between kind of what side he picks, because he says it doesn't matter if you deserve her to be in her prison, you still need to get out. He thinks that he deserves to sit here and be in punishment. He also doesn't want to leave Ren. He loves her that much. He still wants to pick her. By leaving, he's afraid that she's going to think that he doesn't care for her, doesn't choose her. But he also recognizes that if he doesn't go to Jude, it's going to be worse than it is. She's going to assume the worst, and she's going to act in like the worst possible situation. So he kind of needs to leave. So he needs to make a decision, and that's what this chapter kind of is him making a decision of what do you do when you're in a rock and a hard place. There's 2 points in this sentence I want to talk about. Since he's unlikely to be able to sleep again, Oak goes through the exercises the ghost taught him long ago so he could still practice while stuck in the mortal world. The first thing is the ghost and the leniency or forgiveness that Jude is willing to give. And it's interesting how many people she's willing to give. And I think that, in all honesty, she would have let Valerian go. She did the first time. The only reason why she did the second time was that he was trying to unalive her and she attacked. But even then, if she had just wounded him, she would have let him go, I think. In all honesty, the only people that she was really against was kind of Balkan and even Maddox, but it took time for Maddox. She encouraged Balkan to be banished after the first book, but not Maddox, even though they were both involved in this. And in all honesty, Maddox was way more involved, way more running the show than Balkan in that first one. And even at the end, she only banished Maddox when, in all honesty, his actions should have led to his execution. And the thing with the ghost is that he betrayed them on numerous fronts, that he's a threat, especially with Maddox still knowing his, full name, but yet she keeps him close to her family. And yeah, I know the ghost and Taryn are rumored to have a relationship, but still, it's kind of a risk to have someone like the ghost so close not only to your family, but also the only other surviving Greenbrier, which is Oak, and to train him. But I kind of like that he trains him, kind of like how he sort of trained Jude. But also the other point I want to talk about is Oak saying that when he was stuck in the mortal world, while he has a decent relationship with the mortal world, this one word stuck tells us enough about his feelings about it that it felt like he was banished. And I think he talked about it either in this book or the last book, that it felt sort of like a punishment, like he was being punished, he was being sent away, even though it was to keep him safe. But why was he being sent away to the mortal world? And while it did help his upbringing, he did enjoy his time there, it still felt like being sent away and being stuck there. It was against his will. He didn't choose to do this. He was told to do this, which again goes into the same thing with Jude thrusting the crown on him. He didn't choose this. Jude chose it for him. Oak thinks back to the Crystal Witch when he met her in the swamp and her calling him the Prince of Foxes. She says more, but it's the Prince of Foxes I wanted to call out because, one, he makes you think obviously of Locke. He was normally called and referred to being fox, like acting like a fox, being like a fox. And it's interesting to me because Oak has hooves and horns. He looks like his father Dane. They don't look like foxes, not like Locke did. But yet he's being called Prince of Foxes by this great older being. So what does it mean? And I don't know, but like foxes symbolize obviously playfulness and like cunning and intelligence, but also resilience and prosperity and a time of change. And I wonder if it's that last one, that oak is a symbol of potential change, changing of how things have been, which I wonder if the Crystal Witch is a part of this whole scheme of Melev's heart, that she recognizes that by keeping Melev's heart right behind, by his side, he is on the cusp of changing things, because the two of them together would change how Elfhame is, whether it is to destroy Elfhame and put Melev in charge, or it's to unite those two lines as the original witch had intended, as we learned in the last book. And this is why I think nature versus nurture is the big theme of this book, when Oak thinks to himself that he's stuck to the rules Renee had given to him. Sure, he knew the right things to say to make someone like him, but he told himself that he wasn't the same as just giving himself over to the magic, not the same as enchanting them. But sitting in the dark, he has reconsidered. What if the power leaches out of him like a miasma? Nope. Like a poison. Perhaps the seduction of conspirators had done wasn't his being clever or companionable. Instead, he was using a power they couldn't fight against. What if he is a much worse person than he's supposed? And it's again blaming their nature, blaming them. What if he can't control this aspect of himself? It just comes out of him and blames something and tries to say is out of his hands when it's kind of is in his hands. But at the same time, we also don't know if he's not, telling the truth. Maybe it does just leach out of them. Who knows? What Oak says here is interesting. Instead, he convinced himself that keeping the secret from her protected her. But was that true? Or was it more true that he manipulated her the way he manipulated everyone in his life? That was what he was good at, after all: tricks, games, and sincerity. And on one note, it's funny that he keeps a secret from her in order to protect her, because that is a lot of what all the other characters did in the other book, that they kept secrets in order to protect themselves, to protect others, for instance. But the latter part of this sentence reminds me of the nature versus nurture, which I think is him kind of blaming his nature for the way that he is. That he blames his genetics for him being prone for games and manipulation. That's because he's a honey talker. It's because of who his father, whatever creature his father was, that he is this way. But it's not true. So I think I think this book, more so than the original Crow Prince book, really comes face to face and confronts the nature versus nurture idea of, am I inevitably gonna behave because of my nature? Can I not act in any other way? Is my actions and my choices and my opinions and stuff caused by my nature, or is it because I allowed it to become? And it's often used to justify and blame, as I mentioned, with especially like Maddox and Locke, for instance. So yeah, and this is why I love Holly Black. When she writes something like, his gaze travels, evaluating the pockets of her dress for the weight of keys, her blush deepens. The other person assumes that his eyes are traveling over her in a seductive, kind of admiring way. That's why her blush deepens, but his gaze is traveling over her to look to see if she has keys on her. And I love this like double kind of ness going on in this, the nuance of it, and of course the misinterpretation, and the way that a simple act of him looking for keys can be interpreted by someone else as seduction. And it also just goes back to his worry about the magic of, does it just ooze out of him? Seduction kind of ooze out of him, kind of thing. I love this little story that Oak tells us about the last time he used his magic, and how when he had gone to the mortal world the first time he had gone to school, he had felt so lonely, and so he wanted to make a friend and wanted to keep him. And it's not only using your magic against someone, but it's a selfishness of this act of wanting to keep him as though it was a pet. And it's showing, I think, his initial impression of mortals. Even though he had mortal sisters, he still kind of sees them as objects to own, to possess. But during his years and during his times and the consequences of his actions, he changes his opinions and his mind to get to the point where he is now, which makes him he's not perfect, but much more, not nice, but reasonable, open-minded towards a lot of things, and why him and Ren kind of work in a sense. When the servant says, should I tell her that you have been tamed? And he says, no, you should inform your mistress, tell her that I am wasted in all this gloom. One is because he can't lie. I think he acknowledges that he can't be tamed, but it's also leaning into this persona, this aloof kind of suitor, like fop almost. He's kind of foppish. I'm wasted in all this gloom, but like, it's true. He is wasted here. He's acknowledging that it would be better for all of us and to scheme better if I'm with you instead of rotting away in here. So I like that he's telling the truth with his sentence, but he's also leaning into this persona that he's been putting on for all these years. And here's another reason why Oak reminds me of Carden. He acknowledges that his feelings towards Ren, he has every reason to fear and desire anyway towards Ren. And that's exactly, I feel like, Carden's feelings towards Jude. He has every reason to fear and desire her anyway. With this story in particular, it is emphasizing something that Jude had to learn throughout her trilogy, which is that gaining power does not give you more security. It actually puts you more at risk, to be perfectly honest. Yes, you also have more at hand to protect you, but you have more enemies. Case in point, with Oak seeing this particular black snake, metal bodied, jeweled, and glittering, for crawling down, and he's assuming it's done by a very like great smith. It's valuable and dangerous. It probably has poisons, and he thinks that someone could have sent it to poison him to get rid of it so they don't have to pay the ransom. And he knows that his sister wouldn't allow it, but it doesn't mean that there are others that could be doing this behind her back. For instance, Grandma Mog, her general, knows exactly where to find the prince, having been a part of this court previously. And it's illustrating that you can't trust anyone. Even though Grandma Mog, I really enjoy her and I really like her support of Jude, alliances can sway and be bought and traded very easily, even for those that supposedly is loyal and doing what they think is best for the realm. For instance, the good of Rome, coming off of my If We're Villains analysis. And so being at this point, the whole point of Jude doing a lot of these things was to protect Oak, but really she's painted a bigger target on him with this. And it's, yes, because of Maddox initially planning on thrusting him forward, it was inevitable, but still, having this amount of power does not give you security. And then this is why I love Holly Black. It's the biases, it's the false assumptions. And I've talked about this so many times, but she does it just so well, because he says, not to mention there was always a possibility that Carden convinced you that Oak was a danger to them both. That is not a possibility. We know Jude. We know she would never do that. Even if there is a risk, she would rather find 1,000,001 other ways and risk Oak or someone within her family. Even if they have offended or betrayed her in any way, she still defends her family. And so but to Oak, it's logical because of how Carden looks at him, because of Carden's history and things like that. And I love this like assumption, because as a reader we know it's probably wrong, but at the same time we understand how Oak got to this point of making this assumption. When Oak says that there were many nights he had dreamt and wished for someone to rescue him, I think it's really interesting, and I think it shows his age, because it's the same thing with Jude when she was in the Undersea. Both are capable of finding a way out of their situation, and both had previously wanted to prove themselves that they can take care of themselves and take care of others and all this. But when they're in a situation imprisoned like this, they kind of revert back and just wish that someone would come save them, that they can just take a break and someone can take over for them. And that's a normal human experience, but especially at their ages, it makes sense that you just want your parents to come and save you. You want your big sister to come and save you. You want someone to come and save you because you're so tired from trying to do this all on your own for so long. After destroying the metal snake, afraid that it was going to go off and poison Ren, finding evidence that it probably was going to, and loving Ren enough to not risk that, even though it would have solved a lot of problems, he doesn't want that solution. Again, the rock in a hard place, but he thinks perhaps it was no more alive than one of the ragwort seeds, but it had spoken. And that stood out to me because in the last book, when Ren discovered the truth of her, the Melev's heart situation, she thinks, am I no more than a ragwort seed? And I think this is to subtly introduce to us this connection, the spot that, like, where's the line where you decide someone is kind of have a soul, I guess, or have, agency and to be loved, and when something's an object, magic to be used for manipulation, when you could argue that Ren is also magic to be used for manipulation. So it's just like a very interesting argument that she is very subtly putting in front of us. Going back to Oak being uncertain if his magic is kind of seeping out of him against his will or unknowingly, I like that there are moments in here that have us as readers questioning whether or not that's true too. For instance, he's not sure if it's his magic urging him on or not. Almost against his will, Strawn steps closer, and you could argue that it's not his magic, that he's just being foolish and convincing himself of this potential lie, that Strawn is swayed by these jewels, but he's internally debating whether the jewels are worth more than the potentiality of winning Ren's love, which is what Strawn wants. So he thinks she's fair and he can convince her to fall in love with him. And you could argue that there is no magic involved, but at the same time, we equally don't know if it's true. It could be true, but it could also be that Oak is just trying, convincing himself of this lie to kind of distance his agency and kind of give like a reason or a purpose to why things happen that he can't quite describe, which is something that we as humans do too. But like, it would be interesting also if what Oak is thinking could be true, which then I kind of would hate that, because then it would kind of give justification for people like Locke and Maddox when they do bad, saying it's just within their nature, taking away the agency because it's their choices, I think, that make them so questionable and potentially hated because they choose to do this, but then blame it on their nature. So like, this is an interesting argument being kind of like presented to us. The fact that Oak is jealous at the possibility of Strawn calling Ren my Winter Queen, and like kind of like as if giving him a chance at Ren, I think says a lot about Oak, because if you think of in The Cruel Prince, the others never considered Jude really that viable of a potential suitor to Cardan. Maybe someone to sleep with and discard, but not much more than that. And because they look down upon her. But with Oak, even though Strawn is slightly stupid guard, he considers him having a chance, because to him it doesn't really matter, like the classism of it, which I think credits him nicely. And again, it's something like this, something so minor that can tell us about the character, but it's not thrust in our face, it's not told to us. It's these like little actions that on the surface we go, oh, he's just jealous, which is really cute, but also if you like analyze it, you see that like it's telling us a little bit more about Oak's personality and his view of the world. Once again, Oak is reminding me of Cardan, where him like dropping the jewels and letting Strawn think that he is smarter than Oak anticipated, and saying, yeah, I did think you were that dumb. But in actuality, he had used a sleight of hand to get the key. And while Strawn is thinking so highly of himself, he's going to be able to escape. So I really love him using others' perception of him against them, of like having them think so little of him and then outmaneuvering them, which is a very Cardan kind of way of doing things. Also, Holly Black is amazing at giving her characters something that is kind of a setback, something that is making a hindrance to them. For instance, the ghost taught Oak how to be stealthy, however, it is near impossible for him despite his efforts and teachings, because of his hooves are hard and heavy and they clack. So like, he automatically is put in a tough position if he's trying to be stealthy. So that's why I think he leans more heavily on his words, on manipulating others, because he can't quite sneak up on them. Also, it is important that Holly Black took the time and space, because I think she's very cautious of her words and very aware of what she does, to tell us that Oak leaves a guard sword at his hip, but its absence would almost certainly give him away. But also, I think he is very much aware that if he wants to present himself as almost an ambassador, as a neutral, like, I'm coming in to make an argument, to make a deal with you, not to fight you, it's best not to come in armed, even if it puts him at risk of others not interpreting like that, of automatically coming at him with their own swords. I do like how Oak is contextualizing what he is kind of doing, sneaking around and all that, to the video games he used to play back in the mortal world. Even though the video games he used to play, the design of the games looked a lot more like Maddox's like Fortress and like what he's in now, which is, it's so interesting, because it's a way for like humans would have contextualized this world and what they would be doing, but yet he is a fairy and he's a part of fairy and he grew up in fairy, but yet he is still contextualizing it like a video game, because I think he needs to put that slight distance between what is happening in the moment and him. Like, he needs that kind of like, it's just like a game, it's nothing, it's I've done this before, but not really. And so I think it's like he needs to kind of hype himself up that he might have to kill people, and that's obviously something that I think he struggles with. While like I think people like Jude does struggle with it, she takes it as like it's a way of life sometimes, and I think Oak fights back against it a little bit more than Jude did, possibly. But the best is what Vivi said: this is a stupid, ugly, violent game. Life isn't like that. Jude, who was visiting, raised her eyebrow and said nothing. That might be the case in the mortal world, but not the case in fairy, which is where they grew up. And like, Vivi should know that is the case of life, but I think she blinds herself to the world of fairy, tries to ignore it, and like kind of divorces her fairy life with her mortal life. And she's like, that's not how we live. We're not living like this. I don't live like that. But like, she still goes into fairy enough, and it's still a risk. And it's the world where her sisters still live in willingly, and Oak will go back to. And as Oak had mentioned in the last chapter, he kind of saw his time in the mortal world as punishment. And so, like, that is the way of life. And maybe this is a safer way of kind of learning about it and how to work within it than maybe the way that Maddox had thrown Jude and Taryn into it, like just right into the deep end. So the other interesting thing about Jude and Oak and their upbringings is how they view others in the world. While Jude came from the mortal world and knows of its existence, she spent a lot of her formative years in Fairy, and while she technically is lower on the pecking order, being a human, she was slightly more elevated than others, hence the opening kind of chapters with her interaction and relationship with Tatterfell, where like Tatterfell is waiting on a human, which seems demeaning for one of the folk. She's higher up, and the others being like, she's allowed to be educated alongside the gentry. So she had some privileges, though begrudgingly. Whereas Oak started in Fairy, as he acknowledges, then had to go to the mortal world and learned like, hey, laundry just doesn't disappear. You have to do laundry. And because of that, he gains respect for servants. He respects them and acknowledges them, sees them almost as equal, and sees the hard work that they do. Whereas Jude, because she is in a constant battle, a constant power struggle, I think she doesn't respect the servants as much as she could. I think she does and she doesn't. I think she is, because of her upbringing, because of everything, and this is nothing bad against her, this just makes her gray, she slightly uses it to elevate herself when she's in her smallest moments. I really love when Oak knows it's ridiculous, yet he can't help feeling as though they have an understanding of each other, one that transcends the admittedly not great moment. He's talking about Ren, and I completely agree. I feel like there is a similarity between the two of them. While there's a lot of vast differences, as Ren had pointed out in the previous book, like they grew up very different. They had very different upbringings, very different ways that people interact with them, all that. But at the same time, they're kind of the same. They're kind of thrust into situations that they did not ask nor want. They see a better future, a very similar better future for this world, where they have more compassion for smaller creatures and folk, mortals. But like at the same time, like I don't know how to describe it. It's just that like I feels like the two of them are cut from a very similar cloth, just as Jude and Cardan felt like they were cut from a very similar cloth. While their upbringings were very different, they felt very similar in personality and slight thought processes. Okay, so here's another moment of showing and telling. And here's the thing about telling. It is a strange, wiggly, fine line where, like, you can tell, but it has to be kind of in a way of showing, if that makes sense. So, for instance, here, Oaks is thinking he feels a bit foolish as he wades into a vat naked. Should he be discovered, he would doubtless have to play the silly, carefree prince, so vain that he escaped prison for a bath. It would be a crowning achievement of embarrassment. It's telling us his thoughts here, but it's showing us at the same time. Like, it's him telling us along with the action. Like, he's actively getting in the bath, so it's showing us action. He's actively doing that while showing us his internal thoughts of, like, he will have to put on an act if he is caught, while this is simultaneously telling us that Oak puts on an act for people, that he has curated this whole performance while others would assume him as a silly, vain, foppish prince, to then, belittle him, to then undermine him, to then not assume the worst of him and allow him to get away with things. And that is shown to us through this little bit of telling. So it's still technically telling, but it's showing it to us, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. I feel like I'm rambling and just talking in circles. And here's another moment where Oak felt like Cardan when he thinks himself, fine, not everyone would see being thrown into a dungeon as a romantic gesture, but he's choosing to at least consider the possibility that she put him there because she wants something more from him. That felt like such a Cardan. He's like, well, she wants me, doesn't she? She's keeping me here. But like, it's true. He wants to consider, like, if she really didn't want him, she would banish him. She would kill him, but she is keeping him alive and keeping him near. So there's a glimmer of hope, which felt like Cardan. There were so many times throughout the trilogy where, like, he would hang on to those small little moments with Jude to convince himself she does want me, even though there's so many moments where it seemed like she's pushing him away and yelling at him and things like that. And it obviously worked out in the end, but like, it's so cute that him and Cardan, despite kind of being like on opposite sides in this battle right now, like where they're like kind of opposing and they're uncertain of each other. They're so similar. So I really love this like quick, almost throwaway line from Oak where he thinks to himself it would serve her right for never coming to see him and not even to use the bridle and command him to stay put. And it's a really quick way of reminding us of his age. He's 17, I believe, and that's the kind of silly comment we would definitely make at that age, but like also even as we get a little bit older and you're infatuated with someone, because when you're infatuated with someone, often you have slightly childish thoughts, and like he's infatuated with Ren and he would think something like that because it's a little scary to admit what he's really thinking, which is that he's hurt that she never came to see him, and that he at this point would have actually have preferred that she had used the bridle to command him to stay put, because he would interpret it to mean something, even though he would hate it in the moment. But like it not happening makes him upset that she doesn't care enough to do that. So it's like such a like double standard that he is applying in his brain, but it's confusing and not because he's infatuated. The great thing about this chapter is that it's showing us his wavering of what to do, his call to action, the deciding what he needs to do in this moment. Like his call to action is happened, I think, at the beginning of the chapter, the end of the last, where he needs to decide what he's going to do. If he's going to stay a prisoner or escape, how he's going to diffuse tension because he's in a rock and a hard place. But throughout this chapter, we never see him outright tell us, do I want to do this? Do I want to do that? We see him kind of wavering and steadily throw in little things like if he stays, he wants to see her, he can go see her. He escaped, it's her, it serves her right if he escaped. If he escaped, then he wouldn't need to rescue and it wouldn't be a big thing and it wouldn't be a big fight and whatever. But like if he leaves, then like what would she interpret as this? So it's not all at once. It's not a big block that we have to like kind of like info dump almost way. It's threaded throughout action with him going through the motions of escaping and getting changed and bathed and stealing clothes, and we see him kind of wavering of what direction to go, but he never actually says he wavers. It's shown to us, and his internal thoughts is like a line or two woven into and around the action. The best part about the Stolen Air duology is that we're getting new narrators. We're getting a new perspective of how others view Jude. And Ren's view is very different from Oak's, but even Oak's is different than what we got when we were in in Jude's POV. For instance, Oak says here on page 42, he's not sure anyone knows how to stop Jude. Now it fits within the inner monologue he's having of like, what do I do? Do I leave? Do I try to stop them? Can I even stop them? I don't know if anyone can stop Jude, but it's also beautifully illustrating that Jude's a little pig-headed. Once she has her mind set on something, she's gonna go through with it, which she's tenacious, which is a good thing, but also it can lead to problems, and we saw that throughout her trilogy. But I like that Oak notices that, and in this instance, it's a setback for Oak. It's a thing that's standing in his way, and I like that the way that this is being shown to us. And like I said, I just like being able to see characters like Jude and Cardan outside of Jude and Cardan's story and seeing other people's perspective of these two characters. Again, it's the subtleness and believing in your readers that they are smart enough. And this is something I'm so pissed at so many people right now. There's so many books that I have read in the last couple of years where it feels like the writers do not think I am smart enough to interpret things, or based off context clues, or fill in the blanks, or at least go Google something. But like, this is a different pet peeve. But in this moment, I really like that, for instance, Oak thinks to himself, getting a glimpse of her feels more like a compulsion than a decision. It's a quick little line that tells us, without telling us, that he's so infatuated, that it feels like a compulsion, as though he's being forced to do it, but he's not being forced to do it. The bridle wasn't used, as he has already commented on the previous page. This is just, he is so infatuated with her that he needs to get a glimpse of her, that he can't leave without, that it feels like it's impossible for him. It's not a decision, he has to do it. And it's all internal, and I like that like little line you can spiral and talk about and infer so many things. It's small, it's precise, and it doesn't tell us outright something, because Holly Black trusts her readers. I love that Oak recognizes that when everything goes wrong, he has no one to blame but himself. Literally, he says that, which is that I really like it because he is recognizing that he's making a stupid decision, but he's still doing that decision. And I like that also it's showing that the story is being moved forward based on characters' decisions. They're not forced into situations predominantly. Like, Oak wouldn't be in the situation that comes forward in the next couple chapters or throughout the rest of this chapter if he hadn't broken free and came here. Maybe some of this could have been avoided if he had left the Citadel entirely, but no, he had to go see Ren. So it's his choices and his decisions and his actions that have consequences, whether they are positive and work in his favor, or they're negative and they hinder him. This is another instance where we're getting a character bias, and I really love his perception of Ren because he's noting that when Ren was in the Court of Moths in the last book, she flinched at every gaze from a courtier as though it stung, and she made her already small body smaller. But in this instance, she has her shoulders back. Her demeanor is that someone who does not consider anyone in the room, not even Bogdana, a threat. But I think, having been in Ren's perspective in the last book, it's more likely that she's looking above them and not acknowledging them, not because she doesn't see them as a threat, but because she's so scared that she would much rather not make eye contact, that it's better to look off and not make eye contact at the monsters in front of you, and that makes her appear brave and aloof from everyone else, but from her it's just a safety and kind of like coping mechanism. So I really like in this instance we get Oak's bias in his interpretation of her actions. I also love him realizing things but not outright telling us everything and letting us infer things. So for instance, he goes, wait a minute, one of those hags is Mother Morrow, who operates out of the Mandrake Market on the Isle of Innsmere. Mother Morrow, whom the prince went to at the very start of his quest asking for guidance, and she sent him to the Fissa Witch to answer for Melev's heart. And it's laying all the puzzle pieces out about telling us that she probably had something to do with everything that has happened, that she probably put him on this path which led them all to here. Just as we do with George R. R. Martin, we must look at the exact dialogue because it tells us a lot. For instance, when Bogdana says to Ren, the delegation of hags has come, give me the remains of Maid's bones and restore my power so that I can lead them. She doesn't say, may I have, or can I, would it be okay? Like any softer words as a servant or someone lesser would put forth. No, she says, give me. Because despite the fact that Ren is sitting on the throne and Ren having this infinite kind of destructive power, she turns to Ren and says, give me, which is very much like what Maddox had done with Jude. There are many moments where Maddox would talk to Jude, even when she was a queen and on the throne, where he would belittle her and force this kind of interaction where he is still higher than her. He is still her father. She is still a daughter, and she must listen to him, and he gives orders, not requests. And I love the mirroring of parent-child dynamics that we see in both the Cruel Prince series, but also here in this series with Ren and Bogdana, for instance. And Bogdana's speech just gets better and better because she says, my suffering, and Ren's like, your suffering? And she's like, yes. She says, once I have them, my might will be restored. I who was once first among the hags, that's what I gave up to secure your future. Or yes, your future. And Ren's like, not my future, her future. And it's all about Bogdana. She's selfish, but I like that while we're in a magical fairy world, there is relationships and experiences that we see in the human world. We've seen dynamics where parents act like that, where mothers and fathers act like they gave up everything for their child, but really they're forcing their child to live out something that they were unable to do themselves and are desirous of. And it's so that's why I think I love fantasies, when they do things like this, where while it's fantastical, it's almost an allegory as a way for us to view harder things within the world and then kind of work through it. That is how I think stories should work, in theory. So the fun thing about Ren's story in this duology is that it's almost a Frankenstein story, where, for instance, here Ren says, I have her heart, yes, along with a part of the curse, but I am not a child, nor less your child. do not think you can manipulate me. And it's kind of that thing of like, just because you were created doesn't give parents, for instance, leave to use you and manipulate you. But it's the same of like also just the story of Frankenstein. Wren was created. She sees herself as a monster. Others sees her as a monster. But the question asked in Frankenstein is, do these monsters still have thoughts, feelings, emotions, souls? And, should we listen to them, or is it always to be in tangent with the creator, which hence why everyone just calls it Frankenstein, not Frankenstein's monster? And that's what we're kind of seeing with Wren. But with Wren's case, she has a little bit more autonomy, a little bit more, not autonomy, but like awareness than Frankenstein's monster. But like still is a very similar conversation going on here, where it's like, where does, just because you're created doesn't mean that you are owned, almost. I'm rambling, but I hope that makes sense. The other fun thing I like here, for instance, is like Bogdan been like, you are a child still, and Wren's like, I am the queen. And it reminds me a lot of a couple occurrences in Game of Thrones, for instance, Joffrey or even Aegon, where people like Cersei Tywin and, Otto Hightower have to learn that they were wrong, that they assume because they were kids that they can be manipulated, be used, that they can be puppeted. But these kids have thoughts, feelings, and opinions, and they're gonna break free. And you just gave them the most powerful position, they're gonna use it. And here I think we see Wren's upbringing coming back to possibly haunt her. As I mentioned in other videos, and I think I'll try to tag it down below, how the society of fairy is very selfish. It's a give and take. You expect to get something out of it. And here Mother Morrow is offering a gift, but doesn't say she expects anything out of it, nor does Wren question it, which we see people like Cardan and Jude, who grew up in this world, question the exact person, Mother Morrow, back in the beginning of Wicked King when she offered a gift. Jude went, what's the catch? And the catch was that, he was going to have to marry either herself or her daughter. And there's a catch here. She just isn't clever enough, because she didn't grow up in this world, really. Like, she was a part of it for a while and saw the wars of it, but she didn't grow up in it exactly, not in the way that Jude and Cardan did, that she doesn't realize that there's going to be a catch to this. There's going to be her turning around being like, I expect payment for this gift. Like, it always comes down to this in this world of fairy. It's a give and take world. I love in the first part of this chapter, we see him wavering in his internal monologue of, do I, don't I? Do I run away and try to stop Jude, or do I stay here and see Wren going back and forth? But when he's in the throne room and then Wren walks by, we then just get actions. We just then get Oak following after her, going down the hall, all this without the internal monologue of it. Without any internal monologue, without him being like, should I do this? No, I just need to see her. His actions speak enough for himself that he is compelled to follow after her, to see her, despite having just seen her in the front room. That was not enough. He does not need to tell us that. His actions tell it to us in itself. So chapter 3 opens with Wren's opening her eyes and seeing Oak, leaning over her. It's this really cute moment between the two of them, but it immediately ends when Oak opens his mouth and says, I want. And she immediately goes, no, with the power of the bridle, I command you to be, silent and to kneel. And I think that it's out of instinct, because she is out of fear. But it's the I want, I think, is what got her. It's because everyone around her goes, I want, I want, I want. And to her, she connotates that with people chipping and taking things away from her, chipping her apart. And it's because it's a selfish world. And I think she craves a nobleness. And it's similar to Cardan, that I think that's part of the reason why he likes Jude, for that reason. But like, for Oak, he is slightly noble, but he is also selfish, because he did grow up, despite having spent some time in the human world, he did spend a good chunk of it though in the fairy world. And like I said in other videos, in fairy, selfishness is the normal. It's a give and take society. Oak saying here, it's an awful feeling, his body turning against him. And I think it's important for Oak, because it's something that he's never had experience before, not in the way that Jude and Wren has. And the thing I really like about the duology is seeing the parallels between these characters between Oak, Ren, Jude, and Cardan, for instance. But while Oak hasn't had that much freedom in the say of what his future is going to look like, others have decided what he's going to be in the future. He still has always had autonomy over what he's going to do day to day. While they might try to keep him confined, he still has freedom within his confine. Whereas Jude and Ren have experienced complete and utter loss of autonomy, with Ren having wear the bridle and with Jude being human in a world where Fairy can, scowl or use magic to command her. That's why she had to take all these precautions of wearing Rowan berries, for instance. And when Dane offered her anything, she wanted an ability that they can't use that against her, to claim back some of her autonomy and not be always looking over her shoulder for something like that. And in this moment, Oak is finally experiencing how horrible that is, that fear and a feeling that Jude and Ren have both experienced already. I do this all the time. I say something, and then if I just turn the page, they say it too, and they say it more concisely. So, like what I just said in that previous one, he says he understands in a way that he never has before Ren's horror of the bridle, Jude's need for control. He's never felt this kind of helplessness. I also really love this small detail of when using the bridle, she says, "By Grimson, I command you to do exactly." And it's not by the bridle a command, it's by Grimson, the creator, this narcissistic guy that wanted to have his name live in infamy, and by using one of his, creations, his name does continue on in a way. When Oak says, "It is hard to imagine her as she was when they began their quest, a feral girl who seemed like the living embodiment of the woods, wild and brave and kind." And I think that is one of the reasons why he was initially attracted to her. I think there's a lot of reasons, but I think he really became attracted to her. Like, initially, I think he felt bad for her, their first meeting, but afterwards, all those other times that he met her during those flashbacks in the last book, she was the embodiment of what he desired. She was free and living in the woods, doing whatever she wants, because that's something that, like, I think a lot of kids experiences, especially kids like Oak that felt like they're being told what to do and confined to keep him safe. He saw her as the embodiment. They all want to run off in the woods and have no parents tell them what to do and eat desserts for dinner, the Lost Boys and Peter Pan, that energy. But in the last book, Oak slowly got to remove that romantic lens that he had on her and saw that she was lonely and scared. And he's saying that even now the shyness is not in her gaze and there's no kindness there either. But I think what makes it beautiful is that he's seeing that this romantic version of her that he had imagined her as is slowly being stripped away, but he doesn't love her any less. He loves her more for who she really is underneath that, and how brave and how strong she is. Again, here's another example of Holly Black doing biases with the characters, which makes them feel real. It makes it feel less like the author's hands are puppeting these characters. When she has, for instance, friends saying how frustrating it must be not to have everyone eager to comply with your desires, how impatient you must have become. And being in Oak's head, especially in this book, we know that's not true. He wanted to be free because he wanted to see her and to prevent anything from blowing up in their faces between Ren and Jude, but he wanted to see her. It wasn't that he lost his autonomy, which would have upset him in any other situation, but it was because of her. He's in love, that he, even losing his autonomy, he's fine with, just as long as he would get to see her. He's fine being in prison as long as she would come visit him, then he would have been like, I could stay here forever. But because she didn't, he just wanted to see her, and he hated that part, not the part of losing his power and sway and princeliness, which is her perception of that makes sense because everyone else in this world wants power, everyone else in this world wants autonomy. He wanted autonomy before, so her assumption of this is fine and logical, but being in Oak's head, we know that's not the truth. As I've mentioned before, there's a lot of moments mirroring with Jude and Cardan, Oak and Ren, but one of them that I love is, for instance, Oak saying here, "I should never have kept what I knew from you, certainly not something like that. No matter how I thought I was protecting you, no matter how desperate I was to help my father, it wasn't my place. I did you a grievous wrong and I'm sorry." Because he's learning the same thing that Jude and Cardan had to learn, that especially Jude, because Jude kept things close to her breast. She did not tell things, and it got her and Cardan in a lot more trouble than it needed to be. And then when Cardan thought that was kind of the thing that you do when you're scheming, is to not fill in the other person, and then it backfired when he banished her and Jude believed it. I think that was a lesson for the two of them, that like they need to keep each other abreast on these things. Keeping secrets doesn't protect the people you love as much as you think it might. And this is something that Oak and Ren are learning right now, and are going to continue to learn throughout the rest of this book, with like him being so uncertain of Ren and her secrets. My favorite thing about this book is the struggle that Oak goes through, not only internally but externally, of him being so uncertain about his words. Because as we know in this world, words are powerful, as we've seen Cardan use his words very precisely, as we see Jude use her words very precisely when making deals and stuff like that. Words are very important. You need to listen to it, or else, you might be caught in a loophole, for instance. That's what happens in Fairy. But like with Oak, because of the kind of creature he is, this honey talker, some people doubt the legitimacy of his words and things like that. And for instance, Ren's saying here a pretty speech, she doesn't believe him in being genuine, and there's like only so, like, Oak doesn't know what to do to prove to her, like, I am being genuine, like, because it's up to the listener to believe if they believe them or not. And I just like love this kind of handicap on Oak, that like, what can he do to prove himself, because apparently he can't use his words. Damn, Holly Black, that was great. And it's like sandwiched amongst all these other things, but this one line that Oak says, I can't harm you unless you let me. Now he's talking about other things, but he sandwiches that in and says, I can't harm you unless you let me. And I really love that, because that's the truth of it. People can't harm you unless you allow them to harm you. You give them that power to harm you, and you decide if it harms you or not, or allow them to keep harming you. But like, Oak saying, I can't harm you unless you let me, is like, I don't know what he's trying to get away with this, like what he's trying to say in this moment, but like I really just like love this line. This little moment is very important to me, where these guards come in and Oak recognizes one of them from occasionally sitting at Maddox's dinner table when he was a kid, and he looks horrified at the sight of the prince on his knees, wearing the livery of a guard beneath a stolen cloak. And I love it because it shows the power dynamics within this world, but also the respect towards that power dynamics, that like you lose your power when you don't perform with it, if that makes sense. Like, to have a king bow to someone lesser, then you would lose your respect. You see that in history, you see that in other high fantasy stories. Imagine if that was to happen in Game of Thrones. If Dany was to bow to someone lesser, then that takes her power away. And that is what's happening here, because as Varys says in Game of Thrones, power is a fickle thing. It is a mama's farce, a shadow on the wall. It is something that is left up to each individual person to give importance to. But continuing off that last video, also, this is important because Oak has always kind of bucked against it. He wants to kind of be almost equal with people, and he doesn't have to fight for his power because it's been handed to him as, I think, a boy prince in this world, and he doesn't want to be treated special. However, I think he still needs to learn what it's like to have no power. Like, in this moment, he's slowly starting to learn. Like, he thinks he's had moments without autonomy, but he's never had moments where total no power at the bottom of the barrel, kind of, about rung kind of thing. Even Jude has slightly more than other humans, but Jude was slightly lower. But like, even Ren had some, but not much, from being technically the daughter of a ruler. But still, it's fascinating to watch like this interaction of someone that's always had power, in the way that they interact with it, in the way that they are very flippant about it, whereas others would kill and die for that kind of level of power. And continuing off the way that Bran had looked at Oak, him kneeling this prince, the horrifiedness of it is then immediately followed with him questioning Oak and kicking him. Seeing him in that position lowered his way he is viewed, his like standing in power, which then allowed Bran to feel entitled and capable of causing harm to him, of kicking him, because now he seems like he's fallen down a couple of rungs on this, power social hierarchy ladder. And like, I really love that Ren is the opposite, where she's showing that he's so flippant about power and like his standing, that she's reflecting that with like her saying like, you deserve to be punished. You came into my room, you know broken out of my prison, come to my rooms, and you made a mockery of my guards. Because of that, he is kind of poking holes at her power, because again, power is a shadow on the wall, is a farce, and he's doing it so flippantly, not realizing that like he's affecting her by doing this too. I also really like that he's like, I'm your pet, keep me by your side, don't put me back on my pen, you can just pull my leash out. And to me, that's fascinating, because that's what happened to her. She was always kept kind of close by her supposed parents on a leash. And I think while she doesn't like putting the bridle on Oak, while she did do it, it makes it much easier for her to stomach if he is out of sight. Keeping him close by wearing that, I think, makes her really uncomfortable, but yet not uncomfortable enough to remove it. This is brilliant. I love this, with the Ren throwing back this secret that Oak had shared with her in the last book, of his confession of using his clamor to force his mortar sister to strike herself. And she's like, how would you feel as she felt? And I love that he revealed that, trying to be like, I regret this, but it being open-ended enough and horrible enough, like not that horrible, but horrible enough for Ren to take it and twist it to how she wants to use it in this moment, how she wants to view Oak. That I like that it's vague enough that one could view it as him regretting his previous childish actions and learning from it, and learning that magic isn't fun for everyone, as Oak had said earlier in this book. But you could also view it as Ren is starting to twist it into, which is that he's like everyone else. He would harm others in that way. And even Jude was fearful for him for a while. I think Jude could still be slightly fearful of him, thinking back on that one occasion. She thought about it a couple times in her trilogy. And then I love him thinking he says nothing he says could possibly help him. Which, like, that's the truth of it, that not only is his words being twisted, and Ren is already not believing anything out of his mouth, but I think he's recognizing that she has painted this picture of him at this moment in time in her head, and no matter what he does, he won't be able to fix it, because whatever he says, she's going to think that he's trying to manipulate her. I also really like how Oak and Cardan are similar in this way, where they're both willingly, or say that they're willing to do whatever to prove themselves to Jude and Ren, but yet when they're commanded to do things, they squirm against it, because I think it goes against their nature, against their upbringing. They're taught to be selfish, as I said, but they also just want to be treated as equals. They want to be seen as an equal to them, but yet they also don't want to not have them by their side. And so I think they're bucking against it, until like they are all on equal footing. That's what is happening. We saw that with Jude and Curtin in the trilogy, that he wanted to be by her, but he didn't like when she commanded him. He's like, if you asked me, I would have done it, as he said in The Wicked King. You didn't need to command me. And he got really mad at her right before she got taken by the Undersea, when she commanded him again. And it's the same as this with Oak. He's like, you could just ask me to stand by your side and be faithful, and I would. You don't need to command me and humiliate me to do so. I really love how Oak wonders how far Ren would go if that guard was not in the room, that she would thinking that she would go farther, but I think if he was in the room, she wouldn't go this far in the first place. She's doing this as a show to show her power, to give herself the necessary power needed to keep herself safe, is so she thinks, and have everything under control. But if the guard wasn't here, she wouldn't be doing this. When Ren says, I've been tricked by the prince often enough to know how clever he can be, I love the double standard of that like, you want to be clever in this world to ensure your safety, ensure your power, all this, and like, you're praised for being clever. Jude is praised for being clever. Cardan is praised for being clever. However, you are viewed then warily by others. You're viewed with anticipation that they're going to be clever against you. It's the same, for instance, as like Littlefinger in Game of Thrones, that he's considered clever, but you got to be wary around him, because you don't know if he's scheming against you. So Bran, the guard that used to be someone that Oak had seen at Maddox's table as a kid, I love this arc kind of we're seeing throughout this chapter, where he walked in horrified seeing Oak on his knees, but then he felt empowered enough seeing him belittled like that to kick him, but yet again when he's being threatened to be whipped, he looks uncomfortable by this. And I really like that there's this like uncertainty of how he should be viewing someone like Oak and what his power situation is and if it's going to backfire on him and stuff like that. Like, I really like this view of someone lesser, the small folk, for instance, of how those in power kind of affect them and how they're kind of dancing on coals of not certain where to put their foot down because it could backfire them no matter what. The chapter ends with Oak struggling, but Ren presses her fingers to his cheek. He goes still beneath her touch, and she says, "Go with Dawn, do not resist him, do not fight him, blah, 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 blah." And I like that she doesn't command him it, but he stills and listens to her as though it's a command, which I really wish that she would notice, but I love that she doesn't notice that she doesn't need to command him because he would listen to her still in moments like this. One of the reasons why I focus on the specific wording in Holly Black's books is not only because you can tell that she herself puts a lot of attention and detail in the words she chooses. She is very precise and concise also with her wording. She doesn't go on forever, which is my problem, as you probably can tell with these videos, but she really thinks about them, but also because of the world that this exists in. And fairy wording is very important, as Jude had noted to us in the original trilogy, that this precise wording could dictate whether you could close or leave loopholes open for fairies to use and abuse. That when you're making bargains and deals, you need to be precise. And same with the line, they can't lie, so they're very precise with their wording. And it can have multiple meanings, as we see with Cardan. But I'm bringing that up because in the beginning of chapter 4, Oak says, when the guards are talking about whether they should bring him to the interrogation room so they can punish him before they get punished themselves for what he had done and at least get some information out of him. And he says, "I'm a valuable possession." He doesn't say I'm a valuable person, which he is. He's a prince of Alpine, which is overruling all of them. Think of, all these smaller courts are like the lords, like Stark, Lannister, all that under the current king. That is the equivalent going on here, but no, he says possession. Now, he could be saying that because he is a very good mirror. He mirrors what other people expect him to be like or look like, and he knows that they view him as a possession, not a real person. So deeming himself as a person might infuriate them, remind them of his status, remind them of their place on this hierarchy, and also kind of make it hard for them to abuse him if they view him as a person. But I think also it could show that he doesn't see himself as a person, potentially, that he sees himself as a possession being used and moved around on the chessboard by Maddox, by Jude, by others. One of the reasons why I really enjoy the Court Prince series is the court politics. It's well done, I think, in my opinion. Especially, it's well done in a sense that it still considers itself YA without being too complicated, but yet having still nuance. It's like Game of Thrones, but not as convoluted as Game of Thrones can be at times. And I'm bringing it up because one of the guards is saying, "You don't recognize me to Oak." Of course you wouldn't. I'm just another of your father's people, just another one who fought and bled and nearly died to put you on the throne, all for you to throw it back in our faces. And it's a reminder that this is court politics. I really enjoyed this because it's having us interact with one of the small folk, one of the people who help prop things up and is affected and harmed by the petty fights of someone higher than them. For instance, I love seeing this interaction, but also it's so biased because he's taking it out on Oak when it was Maddox that had made this decision, Maddox that he had been following. He's not taking it out on Maddox, he's taking it out on Oak, who was 8. The fact that he didn't want that, no one took it in consideration. But it's interesting because you're seeing that it's not just Oak who's affected by these decisions, but others, the small folk, for instance. So I'm back in my Game of Thrones era, by the way. I've been watching a lot of his video essays gearing up to maybe do a literary analysis of the book, since I haven't read the series since 2012. But it's reminding me right now of Valen a lot of the Blackfyres. And the Blackfyres are the bastard branch of the Targaryens. And they even 100 years or 150 years after losing numerous rebellions, there's still those men that had once followed them, that have been banished and punished, that still are willing to fight for the Blackfire. They don't want to admit they were wrong. They're steadfast in this belief, even their descendants. And I bring that up because Valen Oaknotes was once vying for the same position of Grand General, and that Maddox must have said something to convince Valen to go against the High King. And yet Valen is taking it out on Oak. He's mad at Oak for not wanting all this, all the rest that they had done for him. But I think if Oak has said, yeah, I want the throne, let's overthrow Sarin and Cardan and all of them, Valen would probably support him because he doesn't admit that he made a mistake. And that is, I think, one of the themes of the story is admitting and apologizing for the mistakes you have made, because it seems like a lot of these characters, Maddox included, will not admit they had made a mistake. Not fully. If they do, it's superficial. Valen is an interesting character because he brings up again the idea of loyalty. It's the same with Hyacinth, that the two of them were punished for keeping to their loyalty towards Maddox instead of immediately apologizing like Tiernan had done, as we had learned in the last book. And even here, as Ston is saying, shouldn't we, aren't we going to get in trouble, blah, blah, blah. And Valen says, you take orders from a prisoner now? Perhaps you're still loyal to his father despite being abandoned by him or to the High Court. And it's so fascinating because it's the fact that Ston and Valen had kept to their loyalties with Maddox, that they had been punished in the first place, and they're here for the first place. And it's so interesting because it goes back to the idea that loyalty and power are just shadows on the wall, going back to Varys' quote from Game of Thrones, that they're nothing, they're what we make them. And like the images we see is what we deem them to be. So loyalty means nothing, but yet it has so much weight behind it at the same time. I also really love Bran and the fact that Bran and Valen are within the same scene here, and that they're foiling each other because they were both once Maddox's men. Both had been high up amongst Maddox's table, for instance. They were higher up, closer to him, and yet they had both been punished and both been left behind. And Valen wants to punish Oak for it, but Bran is hesitant. He is hesitant about this, but at the same time, he had also just kicked Oak. And so, again, going back to the loyalty and things like that, but I like that even though Bran and Valen aren't going to exist past these couple of chapters, they still play an important role in the story in the greater world, because it's showing a lot more about what's going on behind the scenes, not just how these decisions affected Oak, Maddox, and Jude and Ren, but also everyone else within this world too. Bran is also interesting because he shows this particular branch of loyalty where you sway very easily. You seem loyal to whatever cause you're with, but you also change your opinions. You don't hold steadfast. You're not stubborn. You're very easily change your opinions if you think that is where the wind is blowing. So I just realized this kind of mirroring of this scene right now, that's reminded me a lot, at least, of like Jude in the first book, when like Cardan and his friends like Valerian, Locke, and Narcia ganging up and bullying her. Like Valen definitely feels like Valerian, where he's very gun-ho, whereas Bran feels a little bit like Cardan, where he's a little bit more hesitant, only jumps in when he thinks he needs to or is necessary. But like it's so interesting, the dynamics, but also because I think this is like a trial by fire, and it's going to dictate how Jude and Oak will react to the folk going forward in their place and stuff. But it's also a mirror in the sense that it's reverse, that Oak has all the power and they have nothing. They're small folk, they're nothing. But Jude had none of the power, and the people that were bullying her had all the power in the world. And I think this is such a fascinating thing to look at. Like, they're so similar but yet so different, and like it really reflects Jude and Oak's place in the world at that moment in time. Once again, I love the importance on words that Holly Black is using in her fantasy story, that words matter, because for instance here, Oak is unable to protect and save himself because of what Ren had said, that go with Strawn, do not resist him, do not trick him. Because of that, he cannot fight back, he cannot save himself when he's in danger right now. And it's just fascinating because I think it's a really wonderful way of showing that words have powers, and words, something that you might say, you might think it is covering just one thing, but it might be covering other things. That's why I love Cardan, because his words have multiple meanings to it. But like here, for instance, it's affecting them. And it's the same with like Oak and Ren's relationship, that he says something but she interprets it differently. So I think it's really cool that she's kind of showing this like fantasy way that you can say something but someone else will interpret it a different way, or it'll affect someone in a way that you unforeseen. And I think that's really interesting too on the era of the internet, where people post videos and say something, and they might, for example, the first thing that comes to mind is a video of someone talking about intellectualism and reading and stuff like that. And her video I thought was very fascinating, but it's very interesting the polarizing takes that people had taken listening to her video. So this is just, it's fascinating to me. This brief interaction is like, I love it. At the end of page 60 in my book, where Oak is trying to convince him, like, hey, let's not do this. Hyacinth has been wanting to show her information out of me. I don't know how he's gonna feel if you jump the line. And Bran hesitates because of, again, the social hierarchy. Hyacinth is higher than them, and they respect the social hierarchy within this world for the most part, because it keeps order and prevents chaos for a point. For a bunch of creatures that crave off chaos, it seems like. But Balin immediately kills Bran, and that again goes into the question of loyalty, that you're not even loyal to the men on your side, that you're willing to kill them. It doesn't matter because you want what you want, and it's a selfish world too. So what is he getting out of it? He doesn't care about Hyacinth because he's going to get something better than letting Hyacinth get this. He needs to raise himself to the queen. He's at the bottom right now. He needs something to help raise himself because, again, in this world of social hierarchy, the ladder is very important. I know we're never going to know the exact mechanism behind this magic because it's such an important part of a lot of fairy folklore, but words and deals and not being able to lie. But I don't know, it's just so fascinating that Oak can remember, like, go with Strachan, do not resist him, do not trick him. Until you are confined again, you will follow these commands. And to him, he's confined. She didn't specify that he needed to be specifically back in his jail cell, just confined again. And I'm wondering, like, why does this count as confined and not, like, his hands already being tied as confined, which then allows him to resist, and why couldn't he resist before? And I'm just, like, intrigued by this, like, specific magic, and I don't quite understand it, and like how it influences them and why it influences them. But at the same time, I kind of love that we're never probably going to learn those kind of things. So I really love this paragraph from Oak's internal monologue where he says, this doesn't seem like a good move, it doesn't seem clever, and Oak doesn't like the idea that Balin may be desperate enough or paranoid enough to make decisions that don't make strategic sense. He's not an amateur. He must have really believed that Bran was about to betray him, because it beautifully and wonderfully and subtly shows us Maddox's influence on him. And like, the thing about Maddox's children, all his adopted children, is that they are pretty good at reading others, that they can see their weaknesses and see how they work on a chessboard, for instance. And for Oak, it's hard. I think, like, he can't contextualize someone acting irrationally and out of fear, just impulse, because to him, everyone should be working with a reason, a motivation, strategic, and especially someone like Balin, who had once been vying for the same position as Maddox. And so I think he can't understand this desperation, because I don't think he's really ever interacted with that before, truly. So, like, I think it's just, especially in the world of fairy, because most of the time they're not acting out of desperation. Most of the time they are strategic because their whole society is based on strategy and being very conscious of your wording and your bargains. For instance, most people don't walk into things blindly. They manipulate the situation. So, like, for this moment, Oak is trying to contextualize, which I really love his way of contextualizing it, is the way that Maddox has taught him to contextualize things. The other fun thing about Balin, Bran, and Strachan in this situation is the dynamics and the way that Oak expects others. I think he expects others to be like Strachan and Bran, that while they're against him, they can be swayed, that they have some form of honor, that there is some logic behind their choices. But Balin is the wild card. He is the chaos to this situation. And, for instance, Oak saying that Strachan steps over Bran's body, breathing heavy. If he had been asked to choose sides, he might have chosen Bran's, but no one's asking him now. And I think it's showing that, like, there's this variable that I think Oak, it seems like, hasn't really truly interacted with yet. And It's fascinating because I think honor and loyalty again are shadows on the wall, but these are things that are important in this world at the same time. And I also really just enjoy him saying this. He has been poisoned and stabbed many times over the course of his short life. Pain is transient, he tells himself. He has endured it before, broken bones and bled, and survived. Pain is better than dead. He tells himself a lot of things. One, I love how wonderfully it tells us while simultaneously like showing us so much more. Like there's so much going on behind these words of like he in his very short life has gone through some shit that while he does have a lot of privileges and his life is not as tough as say Ren or Jude's, it's still tough. He still has faced these things and we forget it because we are engrossed by this mask that Oak puts on for us that we've seen in Ren's POV and now his, that we forget these things. But also that pain is transient, that pain is better than death. And this feels like something that Maddox would have taught him. Another thing like that. But then him saying he tells himself a lot of things, and I think that's a subtle inference to his honey talking that he even convinces himself of these fictional things. So many times throughout not only this book but the previous one, I've mentioned how Oak has a lot of cardinism to him, but I love in this moment he even says he tries to sound light and unconcerned. He's heard Cardan speak just this way on many occasions, and it disarms his audience. And so it's showing that he does emulate Cardan, that he sees it works for Cardan, and he tries it for himself. And I really love that, like, while he was raised by Maddox and Jude and such, he does have a lot of the mannerisms and thought processes. He also acts a lot like Cardan, even though him and Cardan aren't the best of buddies and don't see eye to eye. He adopts a lot of Cardan's ways and interactions with the court, and him thinking like, I can't fight them, but I can do this. I can try to talk him out of it, maybe. Which is like what I love most about Cardan. It makes Oak equally fascinating because for Cardan, he wasn't good with the sword, nor did he really care to become good with the sword, but he was good with his words, and that was his weapon of choice. Whereas Oak, we've seen, is good with the sword, yet he still chooses to use his words over his sword. When push comes to shove, he will use his sword, but he prefers his words first. Whereas I think Jude prefers stabbing first and words after. When Oak says Strawn is a fool if he thinks himself safe. And I love it because he is, I feel like, pushing his own experience onto Strawn. While Strawn is a fool if he thinks himself safe in this situation, evidently having watched someone else with them already dying and thinking that he can be fine in the situation, but so is Oak. Oak is a fool for thinking himself safe for being in these situations because Oak is Strawn. He has put himself in situations very similar to Strawn as in now, not this one, but in other ones that we've seen of him, being a co-conspirator to coups so he can uncover them and put them in jail or executed. But like, it's fascinating that him making fun of someone, and it sounds slightly hypocritical because he does the same thing. I think the other interesting thing about Valen is what Oak recognizes finally at the bottom of page 62 is that Valen wants above all else power. He's simmering of it. Now he's desirous, he's hungry for it, and he's willing to do whatever to get it because, as I've mentioned throughout the original trilogy, that is Jude's motivation too. Power, because she convinces herself that if she gets a little bit more power, she'll be safer and she'll have a place in this world. And every time she goes up and gains a little bit more power, it's not enough. She wants more. And that is like the thing about this world that I think is so fascinating. But like also like I love that Oak is kind of coming face to face with someone that is very much like Jude and Jude's desires. And it's interesting to be on the other end of it because he does recognize his family is fucked up, but he loves them and forgives them. But now to be on the other end of it, I think like I don't think he'll contextualize it completely, but it's fascinating that like he could contextualize that they're really fucked up. To be on the other end of their like rage and desire, it's scary. And no wonder people are afraid of Jude. But I'm not saying that Jude is wrong. I think we just need to recognize that while we all love Jude, and I love Jude especially, she's not perfect. And she's flawed. And I think like the one thing I really get saddened by and annoyed by in this fandom is the hatred thrown at Taryn when Jude is equally terrible, if not worse. It's just that we're in her POV, so it seems like, and we're meant to sympathize with her, or else the story wouldn't be good. We wouldn't want to follow it for 3 books and more if we didn't like Jude. But Jude equally is a terrible person. I really love Valen being like, you can't expect me to believe you were going to what? Murder the queen and then run off into the snow hoping for the best. And it's just like, for me, it's fascinating because it's the biases and the forced expectation that of course Oak was going to murder the queen. Why wouldn't he? Because in his logic it would make sense. He would assume he would want to do that because she had imprisoned him, embarrassed him, and all these other things. It makes sense from his point of view that he would do this. But then being in Oak's POV, we know that's not the truth. So I just love, like, again, Holly Black is really good at character biases, and she's definitely channeling something that I appreciate George R. R. Martin. I've talked about in a different video recently, which is that every character in George R. R. Martin's world acts like they are the main character of the story, and that's why his stories are really good. I'm just like, Oak's in like a life or death kind of situation, but yet his jealousies is still rearing its head because he's like, does Sean really think he stands a chance? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Ren might like someone, even though I think he's as dull as a toad. Like, this isn't the important thing in the moment, but to Oak, it kind of is, which I love because that's realistic. When you have a crush on someone, when you're infatuated with someone, that's what you're thinking about probably the most, and you just, like, everything else is kind of pushed to the wayside because in that moment that seems like the most important thing, especially when you're young. And we have to remember Oak's like 17 here. I've mentioned many times that Holly Black is really good at showing us things, and even when she tells us things, she's showing us a lot more. A lot of things are hidden behind the words that she chooses, but I like that when she does tell us something, it's placed so strategically and not focused on. It's not like she puts a spotlight on it. It is a brief moment and moves on. And for instance, here, Oak is thinking that Valen's mouth turns down in disgust. This is what he expects a Prince of Valfame to be: vain and fussy and unused to suffering of any kind. The more Oak leans into that role, the more he will be able to hide himself. And then we go right back to the conversation. But as the more Oak leans into that role, the more he will be able to hide himself. She is telling us what he is up to and his motivations, but at the same time, it is so brief that it's like it's well done, if that makes sense. Like, if you're not leaning into it too much, you're not going into it too much, you're not going into a monologue about all the reasons why you're doing it. This is what he is doing, something we've already noticed throughout the last book, and up to now, the last book in here, but it's briefly told to us too, to give us slight validation that we were right. What Oak says here to Valen reiterates what I was trying to say earlier about Jude and power. Despite grabbing for more power, she has not secured safety as she had thought she would. For instance, he says Jude has an army, she has assassins, she has control of the courts of other rulers who are sworn to her. She has all the cards and can deploy them at any of them. And like, it's showing that she has all the advantages. But even then, she can't protect everyone she loves. She's still at risk. She has a bigger target on her back now. And that was something I think Carter was trying to point to her in the first book, that I don't want to be the king because the target that I already have on my back is going to get brighter. I just want to be far away. That's what he was trying to convince her of, that like being that close to the throne doesn't make you safer. The other great thing about the situation between Sean, Valen, and Oak here is that Oak could easily sway Strawn using his methods, using his words, using Carden's method. Strawn would have been manipulated and he could have gotten out of the situation, but he has a wild card with Valen. Valen is a little bit like Jude. That's why Carden couldn't quite manipulate Jude that easily. And I think it's an interesting challenge for Oak to have now, because I don't think he's really faced that many people like Valen who would be difficult to sway with just his words. This didn't catch my attention last time, and I don't think it's catching Oak's attention, but when Valen says, Bogdana told me that you inherited your mother's twisting tongue. Why was Bogdana talking to Valen? As noted, Valen is a lowly dungeon guard. He is nobody now. So why is someone like Bogdana, who is trying to run this kingdom, puppeting Ren in an attempt, or at least attempting to, talking to someone like him? Now, it could be that she talked to all the guards to be like, hey, be careful of this prisoner, he has a twisting tongue. But at the same time, why? What's Valen and Bogdana up to? Oak has some really great lines because I really like that he's acknowledging that Oak wouldn't have to torture him Ren wouldn't have to torture Oak for information. That she asked him, one, he would be compelled to do it with the bridle, but also he can no more deny her than he could stop his heart from beating. She wouldn't even need to use a bridle. He would tell her anything right up front because he's so in love with her. But it also reminds me so much of Cardan. Think of the Wicked King. I cannot lie. I cannot deny you when he is offering marriage to Jude, and then when he betrays Jude and sends her to the mortal world, banishing her, she says, "Deny it then. Deny me." Like, it's the denying coming up again, and I really love that, like, callback, or at least it's a callback to me. Once again, we're seeing that characters' biases shading, coloring their interpretation of other actions, and it's wonderfully done. For instance, Valen saying, "But you seem to have made Queen Sarn angry enough to prefer you being brought low as her own rises." To him, it makes sense because he sees the world in a power social ladder hierarchy kind of dance going on, that of course you would bring him low in order to rise her own status, and kind of that's what's happening, but that's not the main motivation. We know from Ren that she is putting him in prison, has him in the bridal, but she would much rather have him angry and close and not have him at all, similar to what was happening with Tyrion and Hyacinth in the last book. But someone like Valen doesn't know that and would never understand that. He understands power and he understands the dynamics, and that's what he thinks is going on here. I also love that those closest to him's actions are hindering him. While it's not his direct action, though it is his direct action for being in the situation in the first place, is because Jude sent the snake in hopes of helping, actually makes things tougher for him, because he knows that once Hyacinth learns about the snake, he'll tell Ren, and she'll believe Oak is her enemy no matter what he says in his defense. And I like that he recognizes that like, he knows that she sees him as an enemy, and he's trying and trying and trying. He was trying in the last book too to convince her otherwise, but some of his own choices is setting him up for failure. And now with things like this, it makes him look real bad. And I love this like conflict going on, this like conflict of perception and beliefs, and things are happening and you can argue it one way, but another can interpret it a different way. That Oak was trying to protect Ren by keeping a secret from her, but she sees it as him manipulating her. And so I just love this dynamic of this duology. We get our first glimpse of Oak's magic, and I like that in order to use it, he kind of loses himself. It's the same when he uses his swordplay. So I wonder if the swordplay kind of, it comes from the same place with his magic here, where like he kind of his consciousness takes a back seat, that his magic takes over and uses him, puppets him, which is fascinating when you think in comparison to Ren of being puppeted. So he kind of does understand. And it's interesting that like something that gives him great power he doesn't like because it's not him anymore. So I really love that while his magic has this great power to it, it also has this great hindrance to it. It's a give and take, which fits within this world. Also, continuing off that last thing, it's very similar to Ren's situation, where like she's using this infinite magic, but it also is like eating at her being. But also the fact that Valen can break free of Oak's persuasion is fascinating, which I think is showing a point of also you're persuaded easily if you want to be persuaded, is one part of, I think, Oak's magic that I think it makes us also have to wonder about Dane and Oak and Locke's mother. Like, was it magic used against him, or was he willing? Did he want her anyway because his father had her and he wants what his father had, and he was a very bean counter kind of a child, cunning and stuff like that, so maybe her magic wasn't needed for him to fall and be with her. But it also is showing like it could also be because Oak doesn't use it often, so he's not as skilled at it, and that's why Valen was able to break free easily. But it's just fascinating. It's fascinating seeing how his magic works in the way to persuasion, which is looking at others and their desires becoming what they want. And that is Oak in general, as we've seen. Like, so again, it goes into nature versus nurture. Was he nurtured to be looking at others around him and their wants and desires and keeping them happy as a child in that household with the situations that they grew up with? Or is it because of his nature, because of his magic, that he is always looking at others' wants and desires and trying to help them, which is so fascinating within the world of fairy, which is a very selfish world. Chapter 5 opens with this dream that Oak is having that involves Locke. So let's break it down, because there's a lot of parts to this I want to talk about. First off is that he imagines Locke as a fox, which in the original trilogy, he was described as looking and acting fox-like. But the fact that Oak's mind conjures him as that, because he has seen Locke, he has interacted with him, even if it was only about a year, that he still knew him, but yet he conjures and imagines him as an animal, as a fox. So for one, to me, it stands out as maybe that it's his childhood brain, that it's a way he could imagine and contextualize this character that is greater. Like, he's heard mostly, he only interacted with him for maybe a year, but then probably heard stories leading up and afterwards, and knowing that they're half siblings. So the easiest way for him to imagine him is like a creature, because that feels very childlike. It's a way to contextualize things, but also to differentiate them. That Locke was more animalistic. He leaned more into his urges and desires than Oak might, and we see that with the conversation to come. But moving on, he says that it's twilight, which is the time between 2 points of the day. It's between day and night. It's the in-between. But the thing about Twilight in the World of Fairy is that we learned in the original trilogy that nighttime is their main time of existence. That's when they wake up and do whatever they want for the most part. So this is the beginning of something in the sense of this world, whereas in our world it would be like the entrance towards the end of something. So you could honestly contextualize this both ways with Oak. But moving back, he then says, a breeze brings the scent of old drying blood and weapons. It reminds Oak of the smell of Maddox's house, of home. These are horrible smells, but to him that is home. Maddox is home, because Maddox and his sisters are home. But then he goes into this conversation with Locke, where Locke says, I am a trickster like you. I'm here because it amuses me. When I am bored, I will go away. And Oak says, I'm not like you. And it gets to the heart of the issue of nature versus nurture. In his nature, his genetic DNA, he is the same kind of creature Locke is, or at least half the same creature Locke is. But yet he doesn't categorize himself as that, because Locke leaned into those pure animalistic urges and leaned into the kind of creature he is, and amused and harmed others. Oak witnessed firsthand harming his sister Taryn. Even though he was only 9, he witnessed his sister get married and have beautiful dresses and live in a state, but get sadder and sadder till the one day she murdered him. And he says that he would like to say he hadn't known what she had done, but he had. None of them tried to hide violence. By then they were used to murder being an option that was always on the table, which also goes back to the line from Locke has said in Wicked King, maybe your family should learn that murder isn't always an option. Like, he said something along those lines, or killing's not always an option. And Judah's like, isn't it? Duh. But going back, it's again fascinating that, like, I think Oak has to come to terms with his family just as Jude and everyone else. I think the story is about family and coming to terms about that. And for Oak, it's also the genetic makeup, because I think this is something that, like, Jude and Cardan didn't really have to go through, but Oak does. He has this baggage of the kind of creature he is, with being related to Locke and what Locke had done, and him leaning to his urges as the creature, his mother's history, his father's history, Dane, his adopted family's history with Maddox and Jude and Taryn and everyone, with blood on everyone's hands, being manipulative and harming, and the way that others then view him in this context, but also view him in the context of, like, his place in this world. So he is fighting back against a lot of preconceived expectations and notions, and I think that is his struggle, that while he has a lot of privileges, a lot of people see him in a very particular way than what he actually is. And that is the conflict that he is currently having with Ren, that she sees him this particular way, and he's constantly butting up against it, being like, I'm not like that. But at the same time, he has been leaning into these preconceived notions, because that is a way to work within this world. Just being like, yeah, I'm that foppish little silly prince, and this is how I get around things, because people underestimate me, as Cardan had done. But now it's coming back to bite him in the ass, and this got rather long. So my page accidentally flipped ahead, so I saw that this chapter is actually really short in comparison to others, so it's, I think, going to be focused mostly on his dream with Locke. So continuing off that, Locke, he says that he hadn't quite contextualized that Locke was his half-brother at the time of Locke's death, that whole situation. But or quite how much Locke was a terrible person. And I think at the time, like, it was still kind of a secret. So, like, it's weird to then contextualize after the fact, after someone is gone, that you share genes, but also he was a terrible person. Does that make me possibly going to be like him? Because, as I said, this is the nature versus nurture argument, but also the fact that within this world we have characters like Locke and Maddox and others justifying their actions because of what kind of creature they are. It's just within their nature. It's within their nature as fairies to be cruel. And I mentioned this in a like Cruel Prince rambling video I did like a couple months ago when I was reading Tive. While the main character had believed she was mortal for most of her life because she was a changeling existing in the mortal world, when she finally realized what kind of, she was a creature and it was starting to unravel, she kind of became cruel towards others and teased and harmed them in a very particular way that's fairy like, and her realizing like she didn't like it, but simultaneously she liked it and was a little afraid that she would do it again, which goes into the nature versus nurture. Like, do they have any control over these urges? And I think like him coming face to face with someone like Locke is like seeing the worst possible version he could become. And it feels like he's set up to fail with his genes being that, but then also the nurture element of being raised within Maddox's household, and like you said, murder always being on the table. In the previous chapter, I talked about how with Oak's interaction with these guards and their downfall and them blaming him, it's interesting because Oak is learning that even though he's not involved in this and it's not fair, others suffered the consequences of those in power's choices. By choosing to follow Maddox, they suffered worse than Maddox has. And I'm bringing that up because here with his conversation with Locke is saying, like, talking about their mother, that he had once known her before she died and that everyone she met adored her. She was always laughing. And Oak thought of Hyacinth, whose father had loved Leope, I'm not pronouncing that right, too well and killed himself because of it. He thought of Dane, who had desired her, then murdered her. And it's showing that, like, two ends of the spectrum that he feels like is inevitable with those that come close to his kind in Oak's mind, but also the fact that Oak, Locke, and their mother are like black holes that any that come near are destroyed. As I've already mentioned, I think one of the themes of the story is fighting against your past, fighting against everything coming behind you, your family, your genes, these things. And it's brilliantly illustrated here with the stream sequence, especially with like Oak being like, I'm not like our mother either. Locke saying, you never met her, how do you know if you're not like her? And to that, Oak has no answer. He doesn't want to be like her. He wanted people to love him a normal amount. So like the thing is that this is his internal conflict, is that he doesn't know if people will genuinely like him or if it's because of what kind of creature he is. He doesn't know if he has control over his magic that he is just so inherent to him. He doesn't know if he'll be able to resist these urges to use his honey talk to avoid violence, as we'd seen in the last book. When he would start sword fighting, he would get so engrossed that he would kind of black out and get dangerous. And I think like with not only his genes, but then his nurture with Maddox's household, as I said, it's so much he's fighting against. And I think it's to show, the theme with this is to show that you do have control, you do have agency, despite all this weighing behind you, because we contextualize this in the real world, that not everyone might have the same kind of thing going on in the real world, but others have, family past that might be weighing you down or something like that. You might have a particular mental illness running in your family and you feel like you're constantly being haunted and followed by that, and you're afraid that that's going to be your inevitable future too, even though it may not be. So it's like, I like this is why I like fantasy. It's just, if it's done well, it's just a really big allegory for something else in the real world. So Oak says to that, Oak has no answer. He doesn't want to be like her. He wanted people to love him a normal amount, but that's not true. He wanted everyone to love him. And I love that because of this like argument, again, going nature versus nurture, but like it's also a coping mechanism. Like I think he doesn't know if it's like this desire is coming out of what kind of creature he is, but I think it could be also a coping mechanism of the dysfunctional family he grew up with. He loves them. and they loved him, but they're so dysfunctional and so violent. And I think like with the inner fighting, like for instance between Jude and Maddox and all this during his formative years, and like the fighting of Arenia with the girls and things like that, that I think he became a people pleaser and he just wants everyone to be happy and everyone to love him. And especially after, I think it became heightened when he then felt like he was exiled, he was sent away, it was for his protection. He understands that logically but not emotionally. So I really like these little details coming back from the original trilogy to haunt Oak and affect Oak's future. They tried for their best, but it still fucked him up. At the end of the dream, Locke says, "You're gonna die like her, and like me, murdered by your own lover." And Oak's like, "That's not gonna happen." But it and he kind of has to do it to his lover. Like it's kind of bait and switch where at the end he does do this to Ren. But it made me think of Holly Black's favorite story, and I heard her talk about it in an interview somewhere, like a podcast interview. But she talked about one of her favorite fairy tales is the White Cat, I believe, and it's about these like three princes sent off by their father to prove like which one should inherit the throne, and the youngest was not the brightest, but he kept succeeding in these trials because while he was wandering around to do it in the first place, he came across this cave where there's this white cat and ghost servants, and he would just hang out in the cave with this white cat female girl thing and just enjoy himself and be like, "Oh, she had to go back." She's like, "Oh, here, use this to win this challenge." And he kept winning, and when it was finally like bring back a bride, the white cat who he had slowly fallen in love with said, "You need to stab me." And he didn't want to because he was in love with her, but she convinced him to take that risk, and she awoke as a beautiful normal human princess girl. So like that is what I think is happening in Oak's story. You see the influences of that, but it is interesting that like this, it goes into this area of love of like, is obsessive love truly love? Because that's what I think occurred with Locke and his mother. But I've also talked about in other videos about Locke that he's so fascinating because he sees his value based on others liking him, and if they can, like, he can pull them away from others. Like, am I strong enough? Am I better enough? Am I important enough to lure away Narcia from Cardan, for instance, to get both twins? Like, I think that is his value because he didn't have someone at home anymore to love him. It was just servants, but no one was there to acknowledge and love him, not in the way that like at least Jude had. Like Maddox wasn't perfect, but he was there and he gave her as much love as he possibly could. But yeah.